Hello and welcome to Six Part. Today I'm gonna start a new series. What if Deku was kidnapped by Psychotic Mei? Part 1. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up, and to watch more videos like this, subscribe to my channel and turn that bell notification on so you never miss an upload. Now wasting no more time, let's begin.
As the UA Sports Festival reached its peak, the stadium reverberated with the thunderous cheers of the crowd. Both pupils and onlookers were enthralled by the excitement that filled the arena. Mei Hatsume was unique among the contestants, not because of her athletic prowess but rather because of her amazing collection of devices, or babies, as she lovingly referred to them. Mei had discovered the ideal chance to show off her creations to the audience's pro idols during the obstacle race. Izuku Midoriya, the resolute but somewhat frazzled student who had just about guaranteed his spot in the competition, was the ideal guinea pig for it. Izuku was just another pupil, another tool in Mei's toolbox. The fact that he could test her devices in front of the largest possible audience was all that mattered to her, not his eccentricities or goals. He wasn't so much a rival as a walking billboard in her eyes. "Hey, Midoriya!" Mei exclaimed, her voice piercing the festival's commotion. Using one of her newest inventions, a hoverboard, she zipped over to him. "I've got some amazing babies that'll give you a serious edge in the cavalry battle. What do you say?" Izuku, who is usually willing to provide a hand to a buddy or classmate, readily accepted. "Sure, Hatsume. I'd be happy to help." Mei led Izuku and his group through the war, using her innovations at every crucial juncture. Her devices, which included grappling hooks and jetpacks, let Izuku outmaneuver the opposition in ways that even he was astonished at. For Mei, however, it was all about the technology. She hardly noticed Izuku's relentless labor as she observed the pros in the grandstand, eager to see how they would respond to her inventions. Mei went back to her workshop and started working on her inventions as soon as the festival was over and the enthusiasm subsided. As the festival's adrenaline fueled her creative drive, her thoughts were filled with fresh concepts and enhancements. But when she concentrated on her task, Izuku was only another successful experiment, a faraway memory. However, Mei noticed that she was thinking about the festival more frequently than she had anticipated as the weeks stretched into months. She would be deep in concentration, adjusting a piece of machinery. Then all of a sudden she would think about Izuku, how resolute he had been, how sincere his desire to assist others had been, and how well he had adjusted to her ideas. She had been taken aback by his sincere compliments about her devices. She initially wrote these ideas off as side thoughts, just background noise in her never-ending quest for creativity. However, they continued, infiltrating her thoughts at calm times and late-night lab sessions when she ought to have been concentrating on her next discovery. She didn't know how frequently she was thinking of him until she was developing a new prototype, a pair of improved gloves meant to increase a hero's grasp and control. As she experimented with the gloves, which were based on some of the changes she had made for Izuku during the festival, she couldn't help but think of his smile, his clumsy but charming gratitude, and his unwavering spirit. As she adjusted the tension on a small spring, Mei asked out loud, "Why am I thinking about him so much?" She rarely took the time to think about herself because she was typically so preoccupied with her innovations. She dismissed it, blaming it on her innate fixation with refining her designs. She tried to ignore the thoughts, but they persisted and grew stronger with time. Seeing Izuku around school made her pay closer attention to him because of the way he interacted with people, his willingness to help without hesitation, and his unwavering resolve. Mei was not really sure what was going on. She was too devoted to her work and preoccupied with her love of technology to really understand the feelings that were starting to surface inside of her. The excitement she experienced for her innovations was not the same as the faint, unexpected warmth that grew in her chest every time she thought of Izuku. Though she was unaware of it at the time, the seeds of something more profound had already been sown and were ready to sprout. Therefore, Mei remained blissfully ignorant of the silent metamorphosis occurring inside of her as she carried on working, engrossed in the world of gears and circuits. Her heart was starting to shift toward a new focus, one that she would soon find impossible to ignore, while her mind was still focused on her babies. As Mei worked feverishly on her most recent project, the lab was filled with the hum of machines. She was surrounded by cables, plans, and partially completed prototypes, all of which were evidence of her unwavering inventiveness. She was especially focused on creating a new technology today, a little energy source that could significantly increase the power output of her creations. Although it was a very fragile and delicate piece of technology, Mei was sure she could perfect it. She was soldering a connection carefully when her mind wandered again. In spite of herself, she began to miss the way Izuku would joyfully test her ideas or praise her with that warm, sincere smile, which she hadn't seen much of lately. She was ready to make a crucial adjustment when she was distracted by the thought of him, his resolute green eyes, and his ungainly but charming manner. With a faint smile on her lips, she pondered out loud, if this works, Midoriya would probably love it. She had even made the effort to recall his name and face, which was a quality she lacked greatly and did not wish to acquire. However, her palm slipped during that little distraction, causing the unstable energy source to ignite furiously. As the gadget started to overheat and light dangerously brightly, Mei's eyes grew wide. It burst with a loud bang, sending her flying backward into the lab before she could even respond. The explosion's force threw her into the hallway as she slammed through the double doors. She fell on something firm but soft, confused. Mei adjusted her goggles, the lenses slightly damaged from the blast, as she came to. To see what had broken her fall, she looked below. She was shocked to discover herself stretched out on top of Izuku, who had reportedly been en route to her laboratory. His eyes were wide with amazement and his face was a deep shade of scarlet as he lay under her. "Oh, hey, Midoriya," Mei said with a smile, as though nothing unusual had just occurred. Totally oblivious to her precarious situation, she smiled down at him. Izuku, however, was completely terrified. The realization that Mei was so close, her body against his, her hands on his chest, her face inches from his, made his heart accelerate. Her full-bosomed breasts were contentedly pressing down on his own chest, and the soft material of her filthy tank top did little to hide their flawless shape from the physical contact. This was what really pushed his mind into overdrive. His anxiousness was heightened as he caught the ideal glimpse of her cleavage. "Ha Hatsume." Izuku stumbled, his voice hardly audible above a whisper, searching for the correct words. He was too ashamed to move, and his mind was racing with ideas. However, Mei was totally unaware of his sorrow. When she said, "What a lucky coincidence," her smile was as broad as ever. "I was just working on something super cool, and I was thinking about you when..." Boom! It kinda blew up in my face. "But don't worry, I'll fix it." As though this were the most commonplace thing in the world, she continued to chat eagerly about her idea while standing on top of him. Izuku, on the other hand, was frantically attempting to keep his cool, his hands clumsily hanging above the floor, uncertain of their proper position. His voice strained, he managed to croak out, Hatsume, see could you, maybe." Only then did Mei realize where they were. Her hair brushed his face as she cocked her head slightly and gave him a questioning glance. She finally understood, but she was still missing the point, and she questioned, "Oh, am I hurting you?" Mei came closer before Izuku could reply, her face now nearly brushing his as she checked him for wounds. She thought out loud, "You don't look hurt, Maybe I cushioned the fall," utterly oblivious to the impact her closeness was having on him. Izuku's thoughts were racing. His body was not cooperating with his desire to stand up and speak. He couldn't take the smell of her hair, the feel of her body on his, or her easygoing attitude in spite of everything. Mei laughed at last, a faint flush of comprehension beginning to creep into her own cheeks. She smiled as she eventually rolled off him and got to her feet, wiping the dust from her face as though nothing had occurred. "Oh, I get it, you're shy, aren't you?" "No worries, Midoriya," she replied. Izuku stumbled to his feet, humiliation still blazing in his face. His voice was trembling as he stammered out, "I was just coming to check on you, I heard a loud noise and thought." Mei dismissively waved her hand. Unfazed by the near calamity, she smiled and said, "Just a minor setback. It happens sometimes when you're pushing the limits of science. But you came at the perfect time. I was just thinking about how you could help me test this new energy source once I get it stabilized." Izuku nodded slowly, still attempting to control his breathing. Sure, Hatsume. Anything I can do to help." Mei's head was already buzzing with fresh concepts for enhancing her prototype as they returned to the lab together. However, she briefly experienced that strange warmth in her chest once more as she cast a sidelong glance toward Izuku. She was still unable to fully comprehend it, but it was stronger and more obvious this time. Although she dismissed it as enthusiasm for her upcoming creation, she was secretly beginning to question whether it was something more. Even to herself, she wasn't quite ready to acknowledge it. Mei saw complete commotion as she escorted Izuku back into the lab. The room was in ruins after the explosion, with tools all over the floor, some prototypes smoking, and everything covered in a thick layer of dust. She had been working on an energy source, but now it was a twisted, burnt mess on the workbench. But Mei remained unmoved. She saw this as a small setback on the path to creativity, simply another day in the lab. With a determined face, she adjusted her goggles and started evaluating the damage, immediately considering how to make the design better the next time. She strolled through the wreckage with ease, and Izuku, still stung by the humiliation of their previous encounter, observed. In spite of the turmoil, her unwavering determination was unquestionably astounding. But before he could volunteer to assist with cleanup, Powerloader, the instructor in charge of the development studio, barged in through the lab door. Powerloader's voice echoed across the lab, "Hatsume," as he waved his mechanical arms impatiently. "What in the world happened here? You can't keep pushing these dangerous experiments without proper safety protocols. This is a school, not a demolition site." With her focus already on a set of faulty circuits she was tinkering with, Mei hardly acknowledged him. She muttered absently, it's fine," with her thoughts obviously elsewhere. "Just a little mishap. I'll have it all fixed up in no time." It was obvious that Powerloader was getting impatient. "Hatsume, you need to start taking these safety concerns seriously. You could have injured yourself. Or someone else. I'm shutting down the lab for the rest of the day." Mei's attention was eventually drawn to this. Her eyes widened in real surprise as she stopped working. "Wait, what? But I'm right in the middle of..." Powerloader cut in with a forceful, "no buts," tone. "You're done for today. I want you out of here, now." Mei started to object, but Powerloader gestured toward the door before she could say anything. Huffing, she reluctantly obeyed, picking up a tiny toolbox and leaving. As they left the lab, Izuku trailed behind her and gave Powerloader a pitying look. When they were outdoors, Mei kicked at a loose piece of debris on the ground and sighed in frustration. She still shook her head in rage. "Can you believe that? Right when I was on the verge of a breakthrough," she said. Her attitude, however, changed almost instantly when she turned to smile brightly at Izuku. "Hey, since we've got some time now, how about we test out those new prototype gloves I've been working on? I've made some upgrades, and I'd love to see how they perform in the field." Izuku paused, rather conflicted. Mei's enthusiasm was welcomed, but he had other ideas. Rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly, he started, "Actually, Hatsume, I'm really sorry, but I already promised to meet up with Uraraka this afternoon. We're supposed to train together." Clearly not registering the name, Mei blinked at him. "Uraraka? Who's that?" Izuku laughed uneasily. "You know, Ochako Uraraka? My classmate. The one with the gravity quirk?" Mei narrowed her eyes and tried to remember, but she couldn't. Other students' identities and faces frequently blended together since she was so focused on her task. "Oh, her," she said hesitantly, still unsure of the person he was referring to. Then, though, something clicked. "Wait, is she a girl?" Mei inquired in a neutral yet slightly inquisitive tone. Izuku nodded, oblivious to the slight change in her attitude. "Yeah, she's a close friend of mine. We've been training together a lot recently." Unexpectedly, Mei started to feel an odd emotion. She had rarely, if ever, experienced such a feeling before, so it was strange to her. She never gave personal relationships any thought because she was accustomed to being so preoccupied with her innovations. However, the idea of Izuku hanging out with another girl, someone who wasn't a guinea pig for her technology but rather a real friend, caused her to feel a little uneasy. Mei's forehead creased as she struggled to comprehend this novel sensation. She responded, "Oh, I see," with a little less zeal in her voice than before. She wasn't sure why, but she was more disturbed than she had anticipated by the thought of Izuku spending time with someone else, someone he obviously cared about. She didn't want to think about it, so she swiftly dismissed it. She forced a smile as she answered, "Well, maybe another time then. The gloves will be ready whenever you are." Unaware of the internal conflict Mei was going through, Izuku returned her grin, glad she wasn't angry. "Thanks, Hatsume. I appreciate it. I'll definitely take you up on that offer soon." Mei felt an odd constriction in her chest as he waved goodbye and left to meet Ochako. She made an effort to ignore the sensation, convincing herself it was only a fleeting idea. However, she couldn't help but feel less eager to go back to her studio as she stood there by herself in the corridor. She had never had these feelings before, so they were unfamiliar to her. For the first time, her creations did not take up all of her thoughts. She couldn't help but wonder why she felt so uneasy about Izuku spending time with someone else as she left, going to the dorms rather than her lab for once. Mei had been feeling absolutely and totally frustrated for the last 4 days. Her usually busy workshop had become quiet, her unfinished items collecting dust as she struggled to focus. Her mind would go blank every time she attempted to work on a new innovation, leaving her staring at a jumble of wires and circuits with no idea where to start. She had never experienced anything like it. She had always been creative and innovative by nature. Her mind was typically a never-ending tornado of ideas, constantly pushing forward to the next major discovery. Now, though, she was unable to concentrate no matter how hard she tried. She felt as though something was preventing her from being creative, and it was making her insane. Mei groaned loudly as she sat at her messy workshop and rubbed her temples to try to declutter her thoughts. She mumbled, "What is wrong with me?" as she glared at the unresponsive devices in front of her as though they were to blame. She had even begun to avoid the lab, spending much of her time laying on her bed and staring at the ceiling or aimlessly wandering the school grounds. She could not tolerate this lack of output, and the longer it continued, the more irritated she grew. She couldn't afford to squander time like this because she was Mei Hatsume, the brilliant creator extraordinaire. Her thoughts kept returning to the same point in time as she sat there, attempting to determine what had created this unexpected block. The day Izuku had visited her lab. The day she literally blew herself up on top of him. The remembrance made her cheeks flush a little, but she shook her head and brushed the idea aside. She said out loud, "No, it has to be something else," but she wasn't totally sure. However, when she mentally reenacted the events, she came to the realization that following that day, everything had begun to go wrong. When Izuku indicated that he was meeting up with his female buddy, whatever she had been, she became distracted, the explosion occurred, and then she experienced an odd sensation. Mei frowned and sat back in her chair, biting her lip. She told herself, it doesn't make sense, as she attempted to solve the puzzle. Why would thinking about Midoriya mess with my creativity? However she interpreted it, the timing seemed too coincidental. She had found herself thinking about him more and more after that experience. She had initially dismissed it as mere curiosity because he was always a fascinating guinea pig for her creations. Now, however, it was obvious that another factor was involved. Mei ultimately reached a decision after considerable introspection. She stood up abruptly and exclaimed, "It must be because I never gave him those prototype gauntlets." Without hesitation. "That's it, I've been so distracted because I didn't finish what I started." She persuaded herself that finishing this chore would calm her and restore her creativity. Ultimately, how many times had she allowed an incomplete project to interfere with her work? With a burst of enthusiasm, Mei grabbed the almost finished gauntlets from the rack and made a few last tweaks. She had been trying to ignore the warmth in her chest, but now she could feel it again. In a manner she didn't quite comprehend, the thought of meeting Izuku, giving him the gauntlets, and seeing his face light up with pleasure made her grin. Without more delay, she put on her goggles and left the workshop with the gauntlets securely attached to her arm. She was determined to find Izuku, even if it took combing the entire school, so she didn't bother to see where he may be. Her mind was racing with ideas about how to show him the gauntlets as she walked through the corridors. Perhaps she would ask him to try them out there and then. Perhaps she would get his opinion on how to make them even better. However, as she approached the school's common areas, a tiny part of her, one she wasn't yet ready to admit, was just excited to see him again. She wanted to hear him talk earnestly about how her inventions could make him a greater hero, and she wanted to see his bright, determined smile. Mei recognized how much she was looking forward to it and stopped for a while, standing in the center of the corridor. The thought made her heart skip a beat, and she scowled, fighting the emotion. She firmly reminded herself, this is just about the gauntlets, and carried on looking, nothing more. She knew in her heart, however, that it was more than the gauntlets. She was experiencing more than just the excitement of creativity because something had shifted. She couldn't help but wonder whether this strange new feeling was the secret to unlocking not just her creativity but something else entirely as she continued to look for Izuku. Mei pushed ahead, a little anxious but determined, looking around her for the green-haired boy who had suddenly taken center stage in her mind. Mei nearly bumped into someone coming around the corner as she rushed down the hallways, her concentration fixed on locating Izuku. Her goggles slipped down her nose as she caught herself, and she slid to a stop just in time. Tenya Iida stood in front of her, his normally austere face softening to one of mild astonishment as he straightened his glasses and composed himself. He said, "Hatsume," with that definite formality in his voice. However, there was a hint of caution in his voice, as though he wasn't really happy to see her. Mei tilted her head in slight bewilderment and blinked at him. Unaware of the increasing annoyance on Iida's expression, she said directly, "Do I know you?" He stepped back, pointing to himself as though to remind her of his identity as Iida's eyes widened in shock. "It's me, Iida. Tenya Iida, Class 1A representative. You used me as a..." Iida concluded. "As a human advertisement during the sports festival." His tone was frustrated. "You strapped all those gadgets to me and made me run around like a walking billboard for your inventions. It was humiliating." After staring at him indifferently for a while, Mei's face briefly lit up with recognition. She shrugged casually, obviously unconcerned by his irritation. "Oh, right. You're that guy with the engines in your legs, aren't you?" she said. Sorry, I've been busy with, actual important stuff. Iida was briefly unable to speak, his mouth expanding and closing in an attempt to come up with a reply. She appeared totally unrepentant about the entire situation, and he couldn't believe that she had forgotten who he was. His voice was colored with disbelief as he finally managed to question, You don't even remember my name? Mei dismissed it with a wave of her hand. She stated, names aren't really my thing, immediately turning back to her primary goal. Hey, have you seen Midoriya around? Iida was taken aback by the abrupt shift in topic and looked at her bewildered. Midoriya? Why are you looking for him? Mei simply stated, I need to give him something, while displaying the prototype gauntlets as though that clarified everything. Where is he? Iida sighed deeply, obviously resisting the want to give her a lesson in social graces and basic etiquette. Rather, he indicated the direction of the school's training center down the corridor. He should be at the training grounds right now. He mentioned something about sparring with Uraraka earlier. Mei's eyes glowed brightly, completely oblivious to Iida's mounting annoyance. She chirped, Great, thanks, glasses boy, and quickly turned on her heel to head in the direction he had indicated. Iida watched her leave, his shoulders dropping in defeat as he stood in the corridor. He rubbed his temples and whispered to himself, It's Iida. Not glasses, trying to suppress his frustration. Mei's thoughts of Izuku returned as she turned the corner and started toward the training center. Iida was simply another person in the background of her life, another name and face that didn't stick, so she didn't think much about her brief interaction with him. Finding Izuku, handing him the gauntlets, and, ideally, returning to her typical creative self were what important. That odd warmth in her chest, however, intensified as she approached the training grounds, and she couldn't get rid of the feeling that this was about more than simply the gauntlets. She was motivated by something else, something she wasn't quite prepared to face. And her pulse began to beat a bit quicker as she got closer to the training facility's entrance, curiosity and eagerness combining in a way she hadn't anticipated. As Mei reached the training grounds, her goggles reflecting the flashes of light from the continuing conflict, the sound of explosions reverberated through the air. Her heart raced at the sight of training robots being ripped apart and the scent of charred metal, but she was also tense at the sight of devastation. She approached and saw the cause of the mayhem. Katsuki Bakugo, who was destroying robots with his unrelenting blasts with a savage smile on his face. However, Bakugo did not capture Mei's interest. A short distance away, she could see Izuku moving with lightning-fast accuracy, kicking the robots with great force with his legs to dismantle them. He moved with ease, each blow controlled and purposeful. She shivered when she watched him in action, a weird emotion that swept through her body and left her feeling unstable on her feet. As Mei watched Izuku train, she was enthralled. As she saw his intensity and drive, her previous frustration vanished from her mind, and her heart raced in her chest. He didn't look like him the way she usually did. She resembled a strong hero in the making rather than the inquisitive test subject she was accustomed to. She couldn't quite understand why the realization made her shudder again. She was deep in meditation when she was interrupted by a voice calling out to her. Hatsume, what are you doing here? Mei looked over and saw a brunette wearing the school's gym uniform coming toward her, her face warm but intrigued. Ochako's gaze shifted from her face to the gauntlets in Mei's hands. Are you here to see Midoriya? As she spoke, Mei nodded while attempting to maintain a steady tone of voice. Yeah, I have something for him. Ochako's amiable expression changed a little, her brows furrowing as she gave Mei a quick glance. What do you want with him? Mei hesitated because of an edge in Ochako's voice that she couldn't quite identify. For the first time, she became aware of Ochako's guarded, almost defensive, stance. She seemed to be protecting someone or something. Mei blinked, briefly unsteady on her feet. She held them up and said, I just need to give him these gauntlets, as though that clarified everything. That's it. Then I can go back to my workshop. Ochako's frown grew deeper, and she opened her mouth to say something again, but Izuku's voice broke the tension before she could. Uraraka. Hatsume. When she heard him call Ochako's name first, Mei's heart skipped a beat, but she forced the emotion away right away. Izuku jogged toward them, a broad smile lighting up his face, which was flushed from exertion. What are you doing here, Hatsume? Mei felt a sudden wave of self-consciousness as he got closer. Something heavy and awkward had mixed with the warmth that had previously flowed across her chest. She turned to look at Ochako, who was standing next to her, and all of a sudden she realized the girl was there. She was the one who, a few days before, drew his attention away from her. The person Izuku preferred to hang out with and who appeared to be around all the time. Izuku's happy demeanor when he arrived at them had Mei's heart skip a beat, but she swiftly smothered the emotion. Her intention was to hand him the gauntlets, give him a brief instruction on how to use them, and then walk away. That was the strategy. However, Mei felt her confidence ebbing away as she stood in front of him with Ochako so close. Izuku noticed the uneasy quiet and cocked his head slightly. Hatsume? Even Mei found it hollow to feign a grin. With her hands shaking a little, she gave him the gauntlets without a word. Startled by Mei's abrupt change in attitude, Izuku glanced at the gauntlets and then back at her. He began, thanks, but Mei had already turned away, her head spinning with a flurry of feelings she couldn't quite make sense of. With this weird, disturbing feeling eating away at her insides, she couldn't stay there. She walked away, each step quicker than the last, whispering, "I have to go," her voice hardly audible. Izuku yelled after her, "Hatsume, wait," but she continued. She was unable to. She could simply lose control of the bewilderment, the jealousy, and the weird anxiety that was gnawing at her heart if she did. Mei chose a peaceful location against the building's side as she exited the training grounds and went outside. Leaning against the wall, she attempted to control her breathing, but the feelings she had repressed were now surfacing. She breathed shakily and gripped her chest, her pulse pounding in a manner unrelated to joy. She trembled as she attempted to make sense of it all and mumbled, "What's wrong with me?" She had never experienced such a powerful combination of dread, envy, and want that it was impossible to concentrate on anything else. Izuku was the one. He had to be the one. She had experienced this weird, foreign tug ever since that day in the lab, ever since she had noticed that she was thinking about him more and more. It frightened her, though, because it was stronger than before. Because Mei Hatsume, the innovator who had always been so confident in herself and her objectives, was unsure of what to do for the first time in her life. She tried to quiet the raging feelings inside of her by closing her eyes and inhaling deeply. However, she was confident as she stood there, resting against the cool stone wall, that this would not be as easy as completing a job or passing down a pair of gauntlets. Despite her best efforts to ignore it, this was something more profound that would not go away. The next few weeks were like nothing Mei had ever known. Her formerly unwavering concentration on her creations had entirely shifted. She found herself obsessed with something, or rather, someone, completely different from her. Babies, as she lovingly referred to her creations. Midoriya Izuku. Mei had started observing Izuku's every action since that day at the training grounds in an attempt to figure out what it was about him that had captured her attention. Her life had always revolved around her job and the limitless potential of support technology, so she had never been one to linger on feelings. However, she was now motivated by something new, something she couldn't ignore but didn't fully comprehend yet. She began keeping a little diary for Izuku, just carefully recording his routines, peculiarities, and even social encounters. It started with basic observations, such how frequently he trained, how he assisted his peers, and how he would whisper to himself while he was thinking. Her notes, however, became increasingly personal and detailed with time. She looked at his smile, the way his eyes glowed when he spoke of being a hero, and the way he exuded a resolve that was charming and motivating. She was aware that it was intrusive, yet Mei was powerless to stop herself. The peculiar burning delight in her chest came back stronger each time she saw him. It seemed as though she experienced a warmth she had never experienced before simply by looking at him. She became increasingly aware of how much she liked that feeling the longer she watched him. She used to spend hours fiddling with prototypes and gadgets at her workbench, but lately she was losing herself in daydreams about him, drawing his face, and writing down his name. Even she found the change in her focus strange. She had always taken pride in her commitment to her work, but now, Izuku had taken over as her main focus, and she was at a loss for what to do. She was unwilling to stop. She grinned every time she remembered him. She pictured them conversing, spending time together, and perhaps even collaborating on a project. Her heart raced at the idea, and she couldn't help but imagine what it would be like to be near him, to be recognized by him as more than just the crazy genius. Then one day, when Mei was silently following him around school, she heard something that excited her. Izuku mentioned that they were heading to the mall to pick up some supplies and possibly get some food while discussing their weekend plans with Denki and a few other people. Mei was overwhelmed with a sensation of anticipation she had never had before at the thought of seeing him outside of school, away from the familiar surroundings. She immediately made the decision to follow him to the mall in order to observe him in a more laid-back environment. She reminded herself that it was about understanding, not about being intrusive. Recognizing the aspects of Izuku that caused her to feel this way and the reasons behind her inability to stop thinking about him. Mei's excitement increased as the weekend drew near. In case she wanted to blend in, she dressed a little differently than usual, keeping her outfit casual but functional. She also made sure she had everything she may need. She reddened her cheeks. In fact, She was making the effort to dress up for a boy. It was strange and thrilling. She was determined to remain disguised but close enough to see him, so when Saturday finally arrived, she left early for the mall. Upon reaching the mall, Mei stood close to one of the doors, her heart racing with a mixture of anxiety and excitement. The knowledge that she would soon see him and be close to him once more gave her a peculiar sense of excitement. Mei couldn't help but smile as Izuku and his pals eventually showed up, chatting and laughing as they entered. The boy who had somehow turned her entire world upside down was there, the one who had taken center stage in her thoughts, emotions, and sense of purpose. Mei felt content as she followed him around the shopping center, making sure to blend in with the background, as though this was her destiny. She could feel that blazing thrill in her heart, greater than ever, as she watched him from a distance. It was thrilling, even intoxicating. She kept following him from shop to shop, watching his every action, and she was confident that she wanted to be with him. Mei wasn't used to leaving her lab, much less a busy shopping center, but here she was, following Izuku and his companions closely, trying to blend in as best she could. As she moved into the plaza, her gaze never leaving him, the busy crowd offered plenty of cover. Every time she saw his grin, the way he engaged with his friends, and the sincere warmth that appeared to emanate from him, her heart skipped a beat. She pictured herself beside him, conversing with him, sharing her ideas, her creations, and perhaps even her emotions. She found the concept intriguing. Izuku was more than simply a pupil or a test subject for her technology. He was rapidly turning into her biggest mystery, which she was resolved to unravel. However, Mei heard a voice calling out to her as she let herself think about what it would be like to be nearer to him. "Hey, isn't that Hatsume?" When she became aware that she had been discovered, she froze, her heart thumping. Denki Kaminari was pointing right at her. Izuku had already noticed Denki before she could respond. Izuku looked in the direction Denki was indicating. Hatsume? Mei's mind racing, she crouched hastily behind a neighboring shop cart as panic swept through her. This was more than she could handle. She felt truly anxious for the first time in as long as she could remember, and her heart thumped in her chest. What had caused her to act so recklessly? And why did she feel so self-conscious at the thought of confronting him now? In an attempt to locate a way out, she peered out from behind the cart, but it was too late. Izuku was already approaching her with a nice yet inquisitive look on his face. When he finally got to her, he lowered himself just enough to look her in the eye. He said to her, "Hey, Hatsume," with that same kind grin that seemed to calm everyone. "What are you doing here?" Mei's thoughts froze. She was briefly distracted by his smile, his sincere interest in her, and the way he gazed at her as though he was genuinely delighted to see her. She was unaccustomed to this, unaccustomed to being so agitated, and it was making her unsteady. Mei stumbled, her cheeks starting to flush. She looked to struggle with words, which are typically her strongest asset when it comes to tech discourse. "I was just, looking for parts." "Yeah, parts." Her nerves only became worse when she realized how unconvincing she sounded. To exacerbate the situation, she felt acutely conscious of the casual, somewhat haphazard outfit she had pulled together in a rush. She didn't usually think about how she looked, but now she wished she had done a little more work. But Izuku seemed oblivious to her worry. Rather, he smiled even more warmly and, to her astonishment, gave her a praise. "You look really nice today, Hatsume. I like your style, it's fresh." Mei's face flushed even more as her heart skipped another beat. She rarely received compliments, particularly when it came to her appearance. Unsure of how to react, she found herself stumbling over her words once more, which was a first for her. Her voice was strangely faint as she managed to stammer, Thank you." She looked down, momentarily unable to look him in the eye. I don't usually go out much, so this is kinda new for me." Out of the corner of Mei's eye, she saw that Denki and the other men had begun to back off as she was speaking, obviously to give them some room. As though sensing the uneasy tension in the air, they exchanged knowing glances and chose to ignore them. Unaware of their shenanigans, Izuku gave her a sympathetic glance in return. "I get that. It can be overwhelming sometimes, but it's nice to take a break and go somewhere different, right? Do you want some company? I can show you around if you'd like." Mei felt love spring up in her heart at the offer. She was shocked by his kindness and the ease with which he was able to put her at ease despite her extreme discomfort. She nodded immediately since it was so tempting to think about spending more time with him, alone. She said, "Yeah. I'd like that," as a sincere smile tugged at her lips. The anxiety she had experienced earlier started to subside, to be replaced by a want to be close to him, to have the chance she had been waiting so long for. Mei was even more enamored with him as they strolled around the shopping center. Her heart raced in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying because of Izuku's friendliness, his laid-back demeanor, and the way he looked truly interested in her. Despite her inability to fully comprehend these new feelings, she was clear that being with him felt right, and she was resolved to investigate whatever it was. Mei was thinking about something other than her innovations and her next big endeavor for the first time. She was considering the idea of a deeper relationship with him. And while they kept walking hand in hand, talking about everything and nothing, Mei realized she was prepared to venture into the unknown, no matter how unexplored the area could be. It felt like an unplanned excursion as Mei and Izuku strolled through the square together. It had nothing to do with her workshop or her cherished babies. It was a completely new experience for Mei. She found herself enjoying every moment of it, even though she wasn't used to this type of fun. They discussed anything from ideas for improving some of her technology to her most recent inventions. With his extensive knowledge of quirks and combat tactics, Izuku made perceptive recommendations that inspired fresh concepts in Mei's head. The idea of returning to her lab to test these new ideas filled her with excitement, and she excitedly scribbled notes on a little notepad she always carried. It wasn't all shop chat, either. They also engaged in some humorous window shopping as they strolled along, pausing occasionally to examine odd objects that drew their interest, whether it was a funny device or an article of apparel that Mei joked would fit Izuku. They seemed to have known each other for a lot longer than they actually had, and it felt natural and comfortable. They eventually arrived at the food court and made the decision to have lunch there. They were seated opposite one another, and there was a cozy, laid-back vibe between them. Mei, who was usually quite focused on her work, was taken aback by how much she enjoyed simply sitting here with Izuku and laughing and conversing. Mei kept thinking about how unusual this was from her normal routine as they ate. Although she was too embarrassed to acknowledge the concept to herself, much less express it out, it seemed almost like a date. However, she was unable to ignore the joy that was rising within her. Perhaps it began when Izuku complimented her in the mall, or perhaps it began when he volunteered to go with her, but now she couldn't deny the sensation. She glanced at him across the table, and the smile on his face warmed her heart. She came to the realization that she wanted to be the one to make him grin like that more frequently. As she said, "I've had a great time today," her voice grew softer. As she said, Izuku's eyes brightened and he looked up from his meal. "I'm really glad to hear that, Hatsume. I've had a great time too." After a brief pause, he spoke again in a more deliberate manner. "To be honest, I've always wondered what you like doing outside of the shop. You're always so focused on your work, and I'm glad I got to know you better today." A sincere smile grew across Mei's face as her cheeks began to blush warm. "I'm happy I got to know you better too, Midoriya," she responded. Even she was astonished by the quiet sincerity that took the place of her typical swagger. Enjoying the cozy silence between them, they both sat peacefully. With her heart thumping in a way she still didn't entirely comprehend but was beginning to embrace, Mei found herself stealing looks at him. The silence was then broken by Izuku, who spoke in a hesitant tone. "Hatsume, would you like to do this again sometime?" Mei gazed up at him in surprise, and the shy smile on his face made her heart skip a beat. She could tell he was as anxious as she was because he was so sincere and earnest. His question's connotation made her heart race, and she knew that all she wanted was to spend more time with him and discover where this new and amazing feeling would take her. With her heart racing with anticipation, she returned his smile. Izuku seemed to smile even more as she said, "Yeah. I'd really like that." They exchanged a look that was full of possibilities. The world outside the busy mall seemed to disappear as they ate more of their meal. The connection they were making, which was both unexpected and natural, was all that mattered. For once, Mei was content with the fact that she was beginning to grasp what was going on. She didn't have to solve all the problems now. She only knew that she was content, and that was sufficient. As they ate lunch together, Mei and Izuku were both relishing the relaxed ambiance that had developed between them, and the boundaries between friendship and something more were beginning to blur in the most positive way. Mei couldn't recall the last time she had felt so at ease and truly content simply to be with someone. However, despite this cozy moment, a question and a small concern were still bothering her. She decided to take a chance after glancing at Izuku, who was now concentrating on consuming the last of his food. Before she could stop herself, the question escaped her lips. "So, Midoriya, about that girl from the training grounds, Ochako, right?" Startled by the abrupt change in topic, Izuku looked up. "Yeah, Ochako. What about her?" Mei paused, criticizing herself inwardly for bringing it up at a time when things had been going so smoothly. Even though she didn't want to hear the answer, there was a part of her that had to know. "You two seem close. I was just wondering if there's something between you two." Izuku blinked, obviously unprepared for that inquiry. He hastily reassured her, "Oh, no, it's nothing like that. Ochako is a really good friend, but that's all," looking genuine but with a trace of worry on his face. Mei was embarrassed and relieved at the same time when she heard his response. She looked to be relieved that she wouldn't have to worry about competing for his interest. However, she was embarrassed because she thought she might have destroyed the moment, which had been ideal. She started to add something to make it clear that she didn't want to pry, but the ground beneath them trembled violently before she could finish. Shock waves swept through the neighborhood as a huge explosion exploded from the plaza's west side. The once bustling mall was filled with smoke and rubble, and the sound of horrified screams reverberated throughout the space. In an instant, pandemonium and panic took the place of the aura that had pervaded their pseudo-date. In an instant, Izuku was standing up, his face changing from one of surprise to one of determination. "Hatsume, stay here and get to safety," he commanded in a hurried voice. As she watched him get ready to sprint into the danger, her heart raced. She began to object, feeling compelled to do something, anything, to assist him. "But Midoriya," she began. Izuku turned to face her, determination shining in his eyes. "I'll be fine, but you need to find a pro-hero or a police officer and let them know what's happening. Please, just be safe, okay?" He didn't wait to hear back. Izuku's quirk was awakened with a surge of energy, and he shot himself toward the direction of the explosion's source, vanishing into the smoke and confusion. As the situation's reality struck in, Mei stood motionless for a minute, her surroundings spinning. She was startled out of her daze by the sound of cries coming from a distance and the sight of terrified residents running around. She was experiencing a flurry of emotions, including concern for Izuku's safety, intense anxiety that something horrible would happen to him, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness that she wasn't used to. Her heart was pounding. With her innovations, she had always been self-assured and in charge, but this time was different. She wasn't prepared for the war that this was. However, Izuku was destined for this. She was aware of his strength and ability because she had watched him work out. That understanding, however, did nothing to calm the nagging anxiety that took root in her chest. Mei's mind was racing with contradicting ideas as she clenched her hands. Although she realized she would simply be in his way, she still wanted to follow him and support him. He needed her to seek assistance as he requested. However, her entire being begged her to stay with him and make sure he was all right. Mei made her choice as the noises of devastation increased in volume and the smoke billowed more. She would follow his instructions and seek assistance, but not before letting him know that she was there for him. With only concern for Izuku on her mind, she pivoted on her heel and ran in the other way to locate the closest pro-hero or law enforcement official. Mei was never one to experience danger directly. She had dedicated her life to creating the next big advancement in support technology, ensconced in designs and prototypes in the seclusion of her laboratory. In her reality, explosions and mayhem were meant to be controlled by her own mistakes rather than the outcome of an actual villain attack. However, in the midst of the confusion today, everything felt unfiltered and horrifying. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of war intensifying, the sound of explosions, metal slamming, quirks clashing, as she rushed behind terrified civilians escaping the mall. Every step Mei took made her heart race, and the air was heavy with fear. Mei's mind was racing with images of Izuku despite the panic. He had hurried toward the danger zone, and she could still see the determined expression on his face. Now, all she could think about was returning to him, even though he had advised her to get help and stay safe. She kept thinking about him getting harmed or worse. Her chest constricted with anxiety at the very notion. Mei witnessed an old guy trip and fall to the ground, too weak to get back up, as she pushed through the mob. She hurried to his side and bent down to assist him without hesitation. Assuring him, "I've got you," she helped him stand up. A security guard suddenly stepped in before she could fully stabilize the man. "Thanks for helping," the panting guard said. "You should get out of here. Pro-heroes are already on their way." Mei nodded, but she was already thinking about Izuku. She should have felt reassured by the talk of heroes coming, but instead she became even more nervous. When she told the guard, "Some UA students are already in the thick of it, they're fighting the villain right now." The guard's gaze grew wide. "Then we need to move fast." However, Mei had already started to back off, her mind elsewhere, before he could finish. In a sense, she had fulfilled her role. Help had come to her. There would be backup. For her, though, that was insufficient. Izuku was still fighting by himself. Before her mind could catch up, Mei turned on her heel and started to move her feet. She ignored the guard's cries for her to return and began racing back toward the mall. Her heart raced with adrenaline, and her concern for Izuku intensified as she got closer to the fight. When he could need her, she couldn't abandon him. She wasn't a fighter, and she was aware that she probably wouldn't be able to do much in a fight, but she wasn't going to watch him suffer. It was intolerable to think that something may happen to him, to the one person who made her pulse race in ways she didn't quite comprehend. With her attention fixed intently on locating him, she thought anxiously, I have to do something. I can help, even if it's just by supporting him. The noises of fighting and devastation increased in volume as she approached, speeding up her heartbeat. Smoke billowed into the air as the villain wreaked havoc in the formerly bustling square, which had been reduced to rubble in some areas. The sound of explosions reverberated all around her, and she could still hear distant bystanders wailing. One thing, though, never changed in her thoughts: Izuku. A surge of determination caused her chest to stiffen once again. She needed to locate him. She needed to check on him. Mei wasn't sure if it was a sudden outburst of courage or the onset of her obstinate nature, but she was certain that she couldn't avoid it at this time. Not when there was threat to Izuku. She continued to run back toward the center of the battle, determined to get to him despite the fear that was eating away at her insides. She had to be there even if she was incapable of fighting or defending herself. She refused to leave him to deal with this alone. After arriving at the mall's west wing, Mei stood motionless for a while, absorbing the scene of complete devastation. Broken tiles, shattered glass, and twisted metal covered the formerly bustling shopping area, which had become a war zone. Dust and smoke filled the air, and the sounds of combat reverberated ceaselessly down the passageways littered with rubble. There was a rush of low-level Nomu, their hideous, inhuman shapes smashing through everything and everyone in their path. They seemed to attack indiscriminately, without consideration or purpose other than destruction, and their size and strength were astounding. However, the villains who stood behind them and led their assault were worse than the mindless animals. The commotion was orchestrated by Mr. Compress, who was notorious for his hazardous ability to trap people and items inside his marbles, and Spinner, the villain with the reptilian appearance. Mei instantly recognized them from the Hero Commission's most wanted lists in the press. They belonged to the infamous League of Villains, which carried out innumerable atrocities throughout Japan. As she saw the struggle play out, her breath caught in her throat. Izuku was doing everything they could to fend off the Nomus, as were Kaminari, Tokiyami, and Shiro. Izuku was a haze of green energy, and when he kicked one of the creatures away, the shockwave from his hit sent debris flying in all directions. His quirk increased his strength and speed. Just in time, she rolled to the side as a piece of broken wall rushed toward her, just allowing her to dodge it. Even though her heart was racing, she wasn't going to back down just yet. She was unable to. Not with Izuku in the midst of all of this mayhem. Using his tape to secure himself to a nearby beam, Shiro swung through the air and precisely launched himself at Spinner. Sparks flew from the impact as Spinner smirked and swung his sword to block the blow. Denki was charging up in the meantime, pointing his electricity at Mr. Compress. In answer, the masked villain simply laughed and casually twirled one of his marbles between his fingers. Mr. Compress replied theatrically, "Let's give these children a real show, shall we?" He threw a few marbles into the air with a flick of his wrist, and they instantly grew, releasing more Nomu, this time a group of winged creatures who screamed through the air. Nomus, who had just been called forth, soared into the air and headed straight for the UA pupils with frightening speed. Mei felt her heart pound even harder. The criminals were gaining the upper hand, and the situation was getting out of hand. Normally so nimble and intent on her creations, her mind sped to come up with a solution. She understood she wasn't a fighter. She was an innovator, though, and if there was one thing she could always count on, it was her ability to turn nearly anything into something useful. She turned on Zoom, her quirk, and looked across the tumultuous battlefield for anything she could utilize. A few meters away, she soon noticed a derelict maintenance cart. It was filled with wiring, tools, and scrap metal that could be turned into something useful. A defunct security drone that had been damaged in the initial attack was also located nearby. However, elements of it remained intact. Mei said to herself, "I can work with this," her confidence returning as her thoughts started to piece together a strategy. Mei's hands were swift and agile as she dashed to the maintenance cart, avoiding the continuing struggle by hiding behind a heap of rubble. Her fingers worked with practiced quickness as she snatched up the required pieces and tools. Soon she was using the resources at hand to create a makeshift support device, a miniature gun that fired electrified pellets. It might do, but it was primitive. Additionally, she made fast modifications to the drone, reconnecting its circuits to restore some limited capability. She modified it to become a little flying decoy that could divert the flying Nomu's attention from the heroes. For now, this will suffice. Mei, with her freshly made cannon in hand, glanced around the corner and saw Izuku in the middle of a fight. Every kick and punch he delivered was determined, and his movements were exact. However, she could see fatigue creeping in. With more Nomu on the horizon, he couldn't continue like this indefinitely. She inhaled deeply and regained her composure. I can't leave him to deal with this alone. Unconsciously, Mei leapt from her hiding place and pointed her cannon at one of the Nomu in the air that was rushing in Izuku's direction. She fired, and the Nomu was hit squarely in the chest by the electrified missile. With its wings thrashing, the beast veered off course and slammed into the earth, screaming in agony. Midoriya! Mei exclaimed as she turned on the drone and launched it into the air. The other winged Nomus turned to watch the drone buzzing loudly. Izuku and the others had a moment's respite as the decoy zipped away, and they screeched and chased it. Izuku's eyes widened in surprise as he turned to face her. Hatsume, what are you doing here? Mei held out her cannon and smiled resolutely at him. Helping you, duh, now quit wasting time and get back to fighting, I've got your back. Izuku briefly gave the impression that he intended to debate, but he soon saw that there was no time. He nodded appreciatively and returned his focus to the battle, charging at Spinner with newfound vigor. Mei, however, continued to concentrate on the flying Nomus, eliminating any that came too close with her gun. It wasn't simply the battle that made her heart race. She had never felt a feeling of purpose until she watched Izuku struggle and realized that she was supporting him in her own way. With firm hands, she reloaded her cannon, thinking, I'll protect him. I'll do whatever it takes to keep him safe. Izuku and his companions were fighting to hold the Nomus at bay while the conflict continued. The winged Nomus was particularly challenging, despite their combined efforts. Their enormous screeches filled the air as they swooped over the battlefield, dive-bombing with terrifying speed. Some were hit by Izuku's fists and kicks, but they continued to attack relentlessly. Tokiyami bravely fought with his friend, fending off the ground-bound Nomus with Dark Shadow. But Dark Shadow was weakened by the strong sunlight streaming through the broken ceiling, making it challenging for Tokiyami to master the formidable creature. Even though Dark Shadow was typically so ferocious, the harsh light made it linger closer to Tokiyami. In an attempt to protect himself from a swooping Nomu, Tokiyami said, I'm doing what I can, but Dark Shadow can't handle them in this sunlight. His irritation was clear. Meanwhile, Spinner had regained the upper hand and threw Zero back with a strong swing of his big blade. Zero groaned as he attempted to stand up after landing hard against a fallen pillar. The baddies were in control, and the situation was getting out of hand. As Mei took in the spectacle, her heart thumped in her chest. Even Izuku couldn't be everywhere at once, but he was still battling with everything he had. The baddies seemed to have the upper hand because the winged Nomus were too swift and the sunshine was impeding Tokiyami. Consider, Hatsume, consider, she chastised herself in her head. Although she wasn't an expert in warfare, she was an inventor who knew how to maximize every circumstance. They also needed a game changer at the moment. Electricity struck her at that moment. She turned her attention to Denki, who had been hurling lightning at Mr. Compress but had failed to land a solid blow. I might be able to change the course if I can use his quirk. He turned to face her as she yelled, Sparky boy. Over the commotion, he glanced at her, a little perplexed. He dodged a Nomu that flew overhead and exclaimed, What's up, Hatsume? Now's not really the time for tinkering. In response, with the equations already in her head, Mei smiled. Exactly, but I need your electricity. Come over here, quick. After a brief moment of hesitation, Denki was persuaded by Mei's resolute expression. As a Nomu passed overhead, he rushed to her, slipping below cover. Breathless, he asked, What's the plan? Taking hold of his wrist, Mei brandished her customized stun cannon, the same one she had just used to defeat a winged Nomu. I can amplify this thing if I hook it up to your quirk. We'll hit all the Nomus at once, but I need you to give it everything you've got. Denki gazed at the cannon, his eyes widening. You think it'll work? Mei grinned broadly. I know it'll work. Trust me, I've run the numbers. Just zap this thing with as much electricity as you can, and I'll handle the rest. Denki trusted her instincts and nodded. All right, let's do this. Mei swiftly rewired a few connections to ensure the cannon could withstand the increased voltage as he put his palm on the power source. The majority of the Nomus were collected in the middle of the battlefield, so she aimed the cannon there. She yelled, Get ready. With his jaws clenched, Denki used his quirk to hurl a blast of electricity into the cannon. As it absorbed the electrical energy, the apparatus buzzed loudly, with sparks crackling from the overloaded circuits. Mei's hands worked quickly, resetting the controls to deal with the tremendous amount of power that Denki was supplying. Mei inhaled deeply as the cannon charged to its fullest. Firing. When she squeezed the trigger, the cannon let forth a huge tsunami of energy that blazed through the air in a dazzling arc. Every Nomu in its path was caught as the energy waves spread outward. The electrical charge rushed through the winged Nomus, causing their wings to spasm violently as they shrieked in pain. Their enormous bulk froze in place as the energy flowed through their muscles, rendering the ground-based Nomus absolutely immobile. Every Nomu in the area was struck by the electrical shockwave that seemed to stop the entire battlefield. The attack was so powerful that even the villains, Mr. Compress and Spinner, were momentarily taken aback. The neighborhood became strangely quiet after the tremor passed. The Nomus had all fallen, their bodies burning and twitching from the electricity overload. The horrible creatures were now motionless and utterly helpless. Izuku turned around in surprise after fending off two Nomus at once. As he turned to face Mei and Denki, he realized that Mei was holding the modified gun. Breathless, he said, "Hatsume, you did this." Mei got to her feet, smiling confidently. She gave him the thumbs up and turned to face Denki, who appeared content but worn out. "Told you I've got your back," she said. "Great job, Sparky. We just fried an entire army of ugly monsters." Dazed by the effort, Denki forced a feeble smile. "Yeah, I think I might've overdone it a bit." With a look of sheer relief on his face, Izuku hurried over to them. "That was incredible, both of you. You really turned things around." His compliment made Mei's heart skip a beat, but she brushed it off right away. There was no time for that now. She concentrated on the battlefield, where the bad guys were beginning to regain their composure. Spinner was already up and giving the students a fresh look of rage. "This isn't over yet," Spinner snarled, his sword grip becoming more firm. Still spinning one of his marbles in his hand, Mr. Compress grinned. "Indeed, we'll have to retreat for now, but don't think this is the end, heroes." Mei gripped the cannon tighter, prepared for whatever was about to happen. However, they were ahead for the time being, and that was all that counted. With more resolve than ever, she thought, "I'll keep you safe, Midoriya. No matter the cost." Mei felt a set of hands suddenly grab her from behind as she stood in the aftermath of the combat, her heart still pounding from the excitement of their win. Cold steel pressed on her throat, sending a wave of panic through her. She instantly froze as her eyes widened in disbelief. She barely had time to look over her shoulder when she noticed an elderly woman behind her, who appeared to be random, with a knife to her neck. As she spoke, the woman's expression was uncannily serene. The woman said, "I've been watching you," in a voice that was unnervingly pleasant. "Watching Izuku all day at the mall. You like him, don't you?" Mei's throat tightened with breath. Something about the girl's presence chilled her, even though she didn't recognize her. As she attempted to make sense of what was happening, her perplexity grew. Then the woman's face shifted like clay, melting. The League's resident serial murderer, Himiko Toga, appeared with her golden eyes sparkling with hate, and Mei gasped in fear as her familiar, insane grin appeared. Toga tightened her hold on the knife and pressed it closer to Mei's skin, her sneer growing. "You see, I've had my eyes on Izuku for a long time. But to see him suddenly so close to you, someone I don't even know, it's quite upsetting. Very unfair. He's my significant other after all." Mei felt her heart thumping in her chest. Her thoughts were racing, desperately attempting to come up with a plan. This was a circumstance she had never encountered before. Toga's aura shouted violence, and the threat was genuine. However, the same fire that fueled Mei's unwavering love for invention burned up inside of her. She spoke with shaking hands and a tremble in her voice. She exclaimed, You'll never have him," and even she was surprised by how brave she was. Toga blinked, taken aback for a time. "Oh, and why's that?" Mei's voice was wobbly but getting stronger with every syllable, and even though her throat tightened, she forced herself to continue. Because he's mine." Mei finally told Toga, herself, and the world about it at that very time. She no longer merely found Izuku fascinating. She was more than simply an admirer. In a manner she had never wanted anything before, she wanted him. At last, it struck her. At last it showed itself to her. He was the object of her crush. Mei's proclamation of love only made Toga's eerie smile bigger. The knife's sharp edge burned against Mei's skin, and she tightened her grip. She seemed pleased by Mei's audacious comment, as seen by the twisted glee that shone in her yellow eyes. She crooned, "How inspiring. with a tone full of laughter. You love him too, isn't that just adorable? Mei's nerves were tense, and her heart was thumping in her chest. Toga's unpredictable exhilaration just added to the horror, and the knife at her throat felt much sharper. When it came to discoveries and inventions, Mei was a genius, but this was just not her style. Leaning closer, Toga whispered in her ear, maybe I should suck you dry, Then I could turn into you, and finally get Izuku to notice me. Don't you think that would be fun? Mei's body tensed as the thought made her stomach turn. She attempted to move, but was immobilized by the icy blade pressing firmly against her skin. There was a little, stinging cut that irritated her like a paper cut. Even though she was terrified, she resisted giving up. She had to prevent Toga from winning. Izuku whirled around as if at the exact moment, realizing what was going on behind him. Hatsume, he said, his voice full of rage and despair. His response made Toga laugh, and she gave him a quick, almost playful glance. Oh, Izuku, I knew you'd notice eventually. I'll be back for you, don't worry. Mr. Compress grumbled in annoyance as he landed a few yards from the two girls before Mei had a chance to comprehend what was happening. Toga, dear, stop playing with your food. We need to leave, now. Dark, whirling portals started to emerge behind them, a blatant indication that they were about to retreat. Toga sulked, obviously hoping to extend her enjoyment. But she knew better than to disobey Shigaraki's commands and keep her allies waiting. Toga mumbled, all right, geez. She gave Izuku one last look with a cheeky smile before she released Mei. Don't forget me, Izuku. I'll be waiting. The villainy took the knife away from Mei's throat in a single, quick stroke. When the teenage prodigy felt a stinging pain in her side, she had little time to exhale in relief. As a hasty and cruel farewell gift, Toga had actually stabbed her. The pain hit Mei hard, causing her legs to wobble as she gasped. In an attempt to halt the bleeding that was already discoloring her blouse, her hand automatically went to her wound. Toga disappeared into the vortex with the other league members, her twisted smile still fixed on her face. Izuku ran toward her, his cry echoing in the air, Hatsume. As the anguish worsened, she dropped to her knees, her eyesight rapidly darkening as the world around her started to blur. As she blacked out, the final image etched in her mind was his appalled expression. Mei opened her eyes slowly and regained awareness, her eyesight hazy. She was surrounded by the silent beeping of machinery and the sterile smell of the hospital. Her limbs were heavy, her torso felt rigid, and she was unable to move at all due to a searing, numbing agony radiating from her right side. Her muscles were not cooperating when she attempted to sit up. Instead, she looked around, letting her head loll to the side. In a tiny, poorly lit hospital room, she was by herself. Fluids were pumped into her system via an IV drip that was connected to her arm. A heart monitor beeped continuously in the background, and a breathing equipment sat snugly over her nose and mouth. Mei didn't recognize the random movie playing on the small TV on the wall in front of her. Her head still foggy, she gazed at it in blankness for a few seconds. Her memories suddenly came flooding back as the fog in her brain began to lift. The shopping center, the battle, Izuku. She remembered spending the day with him, and her heart skipped a beat. Together, they had been conversing, laughing, and growing closer. It seemed as though they were a wonderful match. But after that, everything went wrong. After the Nomus launched an attack and the League of Villains arrived, mayhem broke out. Then, Toga, recalling Toga's icy words, the knife at her throat, and the insane expression in her eyes made Mei's stomach knot. She had threatened to replace Mei, to steal her identity, to swallow her blood. Mei trembled, instinctively reaching for the area of her body where the sharp pain was most intense. She had nearly passed away. Her breath caught as the revelation hit her hard. She was abandoned by Toga, and she might not have survived at all if it weren't for Izuku. Tears started to form in Mei's eyes, but she blinked them away. She didn't weep easy, and she detested being this exposed. However, the consequences of what had transpired were too much to bear. Izuku, she said again, her thoughts returning to him. After Toga attacked her, she questioned whether he was all right and whether he had been able to repel the criminals. She wished she had been more capable, intelligent, and helpful at the time. Rather, she had been made to play the part of a defenseless captive. A helpless victim. Overwhelmed by the physical anguish and the emotional turmoil that seized her heart, she momentarily lost all of her energy and stared blankly at the ceiling. The heart monitor's steady beeping abruptly accelerated, mirroring the emotional storm rushing through Mei's frail body. The weight of her near-death experience weighed heavily on her chest, causing her breathing to become shallow. Her eyes were filled with tears, yet something else rose inside of her in place of terror. She was still alive. She took the breathing device from her mouth with shaky hands and gasped softly as the chilly air struck her lungs. She had survived by staring death in the face. For what purpose? What kept her here? With the idea she had been working on for days, perhaps weeks, finally coming to an unquestionable conclusion, the answer was suddenly quite plain. With tears streaming down her cheeks and a grin slowly forming on her lips, she gave a short, gasping laugh. One reality stood out sharply amid all the suffering, even though her body hurt and her head was still spinning. She muttered, "I love him," in a voice that was almost heard in the still room. She had spent so much time watching him, researching him, and trying to understand why, even while she was in the thick of creating, her heart would race anytime she thought about him. This was the result of it all. She was feeling more than admiration or intrigue. She was devoted to Izuku Midoriya. She admired his strength, generosity, and resolve. And since she still had a task to complete, she had managed to draw herself back from the edge of death. Before telling him, she refused to die. A sudden warmth, a new strength, washed over her at the thought. Even though Mei was crying, there was a glimmer of resolve in her eyes as her smile widened. Now she was working for something bigger than any creation she had ever imagined. She had to see him again, to express her feelings to him. Nothing would prevent her from achieving that, not even the League of Villains. The door to Mei's hospital room creaked open as she reveled in the clarity of her newfound understanding. With her body still brittle and her mind still not entirely registering who might be approaching, she tightened instinctively. She was shocked to see Ochako standing in the doorway, her face displaying fear and shock. Mei's face twisted in a mixture of anguish and relief as Ochako hurried to her side and took her hand gently before she could respond. Mei blinked in bewilderment, not anticipating Ochako's presence, much less his outward display of care for her. Mei mumbled feebly, "Ochak," as she was shocked that she could even recall her name. Mei had just made herself commit Ochako's name and face to memory out of jealousy and a desire to learn more about the girl who frequently accompanied Izuku. Now, though, why was she present? Ochako sat next to her, asking Mei a litany of questions in a tremulous voice. "Are you okay? How are you feeling? Does it hurt? I was so worried when we heard what happened, and Izuku, he's beside himself, he was so scared for Yo." Still bewildered and lost, Mei blinked. She didn't understand Ochako's anxiety, yet it felt so real. She had always thought Ochako disliked her and thought Mei was just a bother around Izuku. Mei finally said, why are you here?" in a quiet voice that was tinted with the internal confusion she was experiencing. Ochako's queries came to a sudden halt as her speech failed. Her expression changed, a trace of remorse appearing on her face as she became momentarily quiet. At last, her voice became softer and more reflective. I know I haven't exactly been kind to you," Ochako said, somewhat releasing her hold on Mei's hand. "Since the first time we met, I looked at you in a lesser way. I didn't take you seriously because I thought you were just a bad habit for Deku." Mei's chest hurt in a way unrelated to her wounds, and her heart constricted at Ochako's remarks. Although she had a suspicion, it hurt more to receive confirmation than she had anticipated. She remained silent, though, letting Ochako go on. I thought you were just obsessed with your inventions and that you didn't really care about Deku the way others do," Ochako added in a guilty-sounding voice. "I saw you as a distraction. Someone who didn't understand what it meant to be close to him." The sting of Ochako's confession lingered in the space between them as Mei's lips formed a thin line. Although it was painful, Mei could understand. She had never given much thought to how other people perceived her relationship with Izuku because she had always been so preoccupied with her job and innovations. They saw her only as the strange girl who was fixated on her babies, and handled Izuku like a test subject. After everything, though, she realized that her sentiments were genuine and more intense than she had ever imagined. She wasn't merely fixated on his abilities or potential. He had captured her heart. Remorse softened Ochako's face. "But I was wrong," she said, her voice now barely audible. "Seeing how worried he was about you, how much he cared, it made me realize that I didn't give you enough credit. You matter to him, more than I thought." Mei kept quiet so that Ochako's remarks could fully register. For once, it was not about competition or inventions, yet she was at a loss for words. It has to do with something far more profound. Perhaps, just possibly, Ochako had noticed something in her that Mei had been too scared to acknowledge up until this point. Ochako's voice faltered as she described what had happened at the mall, her eyes sparkling with unshed tears. You came back for him, Mei. You didn't have to, but you did. You ran straight into danger to protect him, to help him and the others. I was wrong about you this whole time. Although she spoke slowly, it was clear that she was feeling something. She wiped at her eyes and sniffed. You're a true hero, Mei. I'm sorry I misjudged you. In addition to the recognition, Mei's heart grew with pride at having done something truly courageous. A sensation of warmth swept across her chest, dispelling the residual discomfort and doubt. It felt amazing to be acknowledged for who she really was, not for her innovations, for the first time in a long time. Mei stared at Ochako and leaned back against the hospital bed with a toothy smile, her normal self-assurance returning. When she answered, well, in that case, you've earned yourself a lifetime discount on all my babies, her eyes gleamed mischievously. Anything you need, any gear, I'll make sure it's top of the line for you. Ochako's tears paused for a second before a smile appeared on her face as she blinked in astonishment. She let out a laugh, and before long, both girls were giggling, the tension that had been between them all this time melting away like sunlight. It seemed as though the burden of their prior miscommunications had been removed, making space for something fresh to emerge. As if they had always been friends, they laughed together, the sound resonating throughout the little hospital room. Their relationship was based on more than simply respect for one another, it was also based on a common sense of what it meant to look after Izuku. Mei's laughter stopped abruptly, and a sharp sense of urgency swept over her body. Despite the excruciating pain in her side, she instinctively sought to lift herself upright by swinging her legs off the bed. Mei's muscles resisted the IV's tug on her arm, but her mind was fixed on one goal: she needed to locate Izuku. Ochako hurried to restrain Mei, calling out, Mei, stop. In a worried voice, you're still hurt, you can't just get up like this, you have a stab wound, for heaven's sake. Mei, however, was so focused and desperate that she hardly heard what Ochako had to say. Her voice was urgent as she cried out, I need to see him. I need to speak to him, now. Mei was doing her hardest to wriggle away, but Ochako tightened her hold and furrowed her brow in frustration. Hatsume, you're not in any shape to be running around. You'll rip your stitches. Just calm down. For a brief while, they fought, Ochako attempting to stop Mei from harming herself while Mei's obstinacy drove her to try to escape. Before a well-known voice sliced through the confusion like a knife, everything was in disarray. Mei. The two girls immediately froze and turned to face the door. Izuku appeared to have ran all the way to the hospital as he stood there, breathing heavily. As he took in the image before him, Mei in bed, attempting to get out, and Ochako holding her down, his cheeks flushed with anxiety and his eyes widened with alarm. Mei's chest tightened with comfort and something more profound as she exhaled, Midoriya. At the sight of him, the desperate force that had propelled her minutes before seemed to vanish. He hurried up to her side, looking her over as though to make sure she was all right. He said, You're awake, in a quiet but passionate voice. I've been so worried about you, Mei. Mei felt a knot in her throat when she heard the worry in his words. Once more, tears pricked the corners of her eyes, but this time they were brought on by the immense relief and joy of seeing him, safe and sound, rather than by pain or fear. At last, Mei muttered, I'm okay, her voice quivering a little. The words became stuck in her throat, but she wanted to say so much more. Her heart was bursting at the sight of him standing there, staring at her with such tenderness. Ochako stepped back, releasing Mei's shoulders and making room for them. As Izuku reached out to touch Mei's hand in his thumb grazing her knuckles, his eyes softened. He said, I'm so glad you're okay, with a tone of gentle earnestness. For the first time in her life, Mei was unable to speak as she gazed up at him, her pulse pounding. She was only able to grasp his hand while making a secret promise to tell him everything that had been brewing inside of her since their first day together as soon as she could gather her thoughts. Ignoring the ache that flashed in her side, Mei sat up silently and put her arms around Izuku. She pressed her forehead against his chest, clinging to him as though letting go would cause her to lose him. The warmth of his presence and the steady pounding of his heart beneath her cheek were sufficient for once, without the need for words. Izuku was taken aback by the unexpected embrace and briefly froze before melting into it. He put his arms around her cautiously, almost reluctantly, so as not to cause any harm to her still injured body. He seemed to know how much this time meant to her without having to ask, as evidenced by his gentle, protective touch. For what seemed like an eternity, they remained silent and content to be together, taking solace in one another's company. A mixture of emotions made Ochako's heart tighten as she stood at the door and watched the scene play out. She felt as though she was intruding on something very personal, something that defied description or words, when she saw them like this, embracing so closely. Ochako sighed quietly and took a step back, her face softening. She was aware that this was not her time. They owned it. The two of them were left alone to enjoy the warmth of each other's arms as she turned and slipped out of the room without a word. The room seemed to grow more quieter when Ochako's door clicked shut behind him. With a trembling breath, Mei tightened her grip on Izuku, causing her body to finally relax. Just having him there, feeling secure in his arms, was enough for the moment, even though she wasn't sure when she would be ready to tell him everything. The warmth of Izuku's body against hers and the steady cadence of his breathing soothed Mei's racing mind as she held on to him. She felt secure and connected in his arms, an overwhelming feeling that she could only describe as love bloomed in her breast. The moment dragged on, and the sensation intensified with every second, giving her a warmth she had never experienced before. Ever polite, Izuku made no attempt to distance himself. Rather, he spoke quietly, his words full of care and concern. His voice was calming and reassuring, and Mei couldn't help but smile even more as he said, "I was so worried, Mei. You really scared me. I'm just glad you're okay." His words made her heart race. As she buried her face more into his chest and allowed his consoling words to wash over her, happy tears welled up in her eyes and spilled freely. She had no idea how much he cared for her, and knowing that only made her heart race. She was unwilling to let go. If she could, she would prefer to remain in this state forever. Mei acted without thinking since she was overcome by the rush of emotions. Leaning forward, she planted a gentle kiss on his neck. It was natural, an unadulterated manifestation of the love and happiness that flooded through her. Izuku's whole body tensed in shock as he instantly flinched away from the unexpected touch. His eyes widened in surprise as his face became a deep shade of scarlet. He stutteringly exclaimed, "Ha Hatsume." His typical poise was completely broken. Mei, however, was so overcome with passion that her tears only made her smile bigger. She was just too pleased, too full of love, to contain her excitement. It wasn't a planned or premeditated kiss, rather, it was her heart bursting out of control. Her eyes were full of love and joy as she looked up at him and muttered, "I love you, Midoriya." As Izuku peered down at Mei, unable to speak, his breath seized in his throat and his mind raced. Her words were full of truth and significance, and their weight hung in the air between them. The sincerity in her eyes told him everything he needed to know, yet he was at a loss for words. Mei could tell by her shaky breaths and gentle tears that she must have appeared a complete mess, with her hair in a mess, her cheeks flushed, and her eyes swollen from sobbing. But she didn't care about any of it. Her sobs were filled with love and thanks rather than anguish or fear. It was so evident now that she had at last grasped her heart. It was entirely Izuku's property. Izuku stood there, his cheeks flushed with surprise and humiliation, his eyes wide. The weight of her confession hung between them, and he was at a loss for words. The gentle, lingering mark her lips had left on his neck was automatically felt by his hand. He was unable to speak as he looked down at her and tried to make sense of the tumultuous feelings he was experiencing. Mei's heart became more than she ever imagined as she grinned through her tears. She extended her arm and took both of his hands in her own, gripping them firmly as though she was scared to release them. In this intensely emotional moment, the warmth of his hands in hers seemed like an anchor. Her heart thumping in her chest, she waited for him, lovingly and patiently, searching his eyes for a reaction. She silently wished for him to realize how much he meant to her, and her confession hung in the air, brimming with unfiltered passion. A bit too long for Mei's comfort, the quiet between them became enormous and weighty. Because of the sensitivity of the situation, her heart started to beat more quickly. Finally, though, Izuku made a move. Gently, he lifted his hand and wiped the tear stain from her left cheek. A loving smile grew across Mei's face as she naturally leaned into his gentle, compassionate touch. Izuku returned her grin, seeing a side of her that he had not previously completely comprehended, a side that was open, vulnerable, and full of emotions she had long suppressed. There was a sense of unspoken understanding in the air between them. Unable to keep herself in check, Mei spoke once again in a tremulous but earnest murmur. I love you, Izuku. I really do. Since the sports festival, since everything. Her remarks came out unpolished and unrefined. I didn't understand it at first. It was all strange and confusing. I wasn't used to these feelings, so I followed you, studied you, analyzed you, trying to find the answers. She cracked a smile as she looked down. I know it sounds crazy, but it's true. I needed to know why you made me feel like this. Izuku listened carefully, his eyes gentle and sympathetic. He led her to talk without interjecting, allowing her to release what she had been suppressing. With each confession, the weight of her words lifted from her chest, and Mei's heart continued to race. And today, even though I was stabbed, she paused for a while. I'm almost glad it happened because without it, I might not have realized all of this. This moment might not have happened. As she spoke, Izuku's face tensed at the idea that she would be harmed by him choking him up. His feelings surged, and he leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers before he could stop himself. They both closed their eyes, engrossed in their close relationship. As though the world had vanished and just the two of them were left at this delicate, priceless moment, they remained in that position, breathing in unison and touching foreheads. Izuku's voice was kind and tinged with remorse. I'm sorry, Mei, for being so oblivious to how you felt. I was so caught up in training, in becoming a hero, that I didn't realize what was right in front of me. And, for not seeing how beautiful you are, behind all the grease, the grime, and everything. You're incredible. That final bit struck a deep chord with Mei. The one person who mattered most to her called her lovely, and his words made her heart sing. She was constantly smeared in oil and entangled in her creations, therefore she seldom ever used that phrase to describe herself. But it felt real to hear it from him in this tender time. Izuku continued, his forehead pressed against hers, his words growing more painful. But, I'm so sorry I wasn't fast enough to stop Toga. Watching you bleed in my arms, it was the most horrifying thing I've ever experienced. I thought I was going to lose you. I guess I would have felt the same if it was anyone else, but with you. I could feel my heart screaming. I felt so useless. His self-deprecating thoughts poured out as he sneered weakly. But before he could go any more, Mei gently reprimanded him by raising her palm to his cheek and stroking his skin with her thumb. She responded, Don't you dare say that, Izuku, in a harsh yet kind voice. Her fingers curled gently on his cheek as she said, You saved my life. You got me here in time. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here at all. You are my hero, forever. And much more, if you're okay with what I feel for you. Her remarks, which were open and vulnerable, lingered in the atmosphere. She was pleading for his heart, not merely his pardon, for him to realize that she was experiencing something more profound than admiration or thanks. Something enduring. For a brief time, Izuku saw past the grease, the idiosyncrasies, and the quirks that defined her identity. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the one who, in her own special manner, had stood by his side and risked all for him. In that instant, he realized. With a feather-soft voice, he brought his forehead slightly closer to hers and said, I'm okay with it, Mei. I really am. Even though it wasn't the direct admission Mei had been hoping for, Izuku's comments made her heart skip a beat. It was a statement of acceptance, which was equally important as a proclamation of love. Now that he understood, Izuku wasn't avoiding it. She felt a tremendous relief from the weight she had been carrying for so long. Nevertheless, she couldn't help but sense a strong desire to kiss him rising within of her. The thought of kissing someone felt natural and proper, even though she had never done it before and didn't know how to begin. However, Izuku's kind voice cut her off as the idea was starting to take shape. With an almost imploring tone, he said, Mei, can you give me a few days, please? I need some time to think. I promise, by the end of it, I'll have my answer. I'll be honest with you, no matter what. Mei was silent as she considered his plea, a thoughtful expression on her face. A couple of days. He needed time to consider his options. She recognized that he did, of course. That was to be expected. Izuku was careful, deliberate, and methodical. Before he rushed into something as significant as this, he would make sure he understood his true feelings. She sighed slightly, not in exasperation but in comprehension. He would want to examine this, of course, she thought to herself. Like a problem to solve or a hypothesis to test. In some ways, it made sense to her, even though it wasn't precisely the passionate whirlwind she had envisioned. He really was going to give it some thought. He wasn't ignoring her emotions or avoiding them. And for the time being, that was more than sufficient. She nodded and gave a slight but sincere grin. All right, Izuku, a few days. Even though she had to wait, she understood that this epiphany, was a step toward what she now wanted to be a part of, and her pulse was still pounding with anticipation. They conversed for the remainder of the day. Mei was hesitant to let him go once visiting hours ended, but he made a commitment to return the following day and the day after that. After a few days, she would be released and permitted to return to school. She was at peace with herself while watching television. Although she would have died if she had been stabbed, at least she was pleased with the outcome of this protracted personal project. She couldn't wait for tomorrow to come yet as the sun started to set. She sang a cheerful song while closing her eyes. Izuku, just in her thoughts. Mei's days continued to drag on. Not being in her lab, playing with her babies, or creating new schematics, seemed weird, almost agonizing. She was losing ground to the slow pace of hospital life, and the silence was allowing her to ponder too much about her injuries, the scars she now carried, and most importantly, Izuku. Her side sutures were still hurting when she moved too fast, but she was mending nicely. In order to relieve the agony and give her much-needed mobility, a nurse assisted her in moving through the hallways. Never one to sit still for long, Mei became restless. Even though her thoughts kept returning to that time with Izuku, she detested being out of action. Her side scar would serve as a constant reminder of the attack and the ordeal she had endured. However, it also signified something more to her. It was evidence that she had persevered, shown courage, and supported Izuku despite the danger. Thinking about how it represented the change in her life, the recognition of her feelings, the confession, and the waiting for Izuku's response, she ran her fingers along the bandage's edge. Her days were characterized by routine exams and leisurely, languid walks in the largely silent hospital. The thing that tormented her the most, in spite of the physical discomfort, was the emotional waiting. After the time he had requested, she pondered Izuku's thoughts and the conclusion he would reach. Mei was truly taken aback when some of her UA classmates visited, stopped by to see her. Not completely recognizing most of their faces, she blinked in uncertainty as they filed into her hospital room. She gave them her typical vivacious smile, but the realization that she remembered very little or nothing about any of them made her laugh. So far, only two names had really stayed with her, Izuku and Ochako. There were several funny but embarrassing moments as a result. Mei scratched her head. Oh, you're from UA too, right? Sorry, I don't remember you, she said frankly. Knowing that Mei's sole attention on her innovations frequently left her somewhat detached from everything else, her guest shrugged it off. All of the girls from Class 1A had joined her by the time Ochako got there, and they gathered around her bed, including Momo, Jiro, Mina, Tsuyu, and Toru. The attention was pleasant, but Mei didn't know why they had all come. She noticed that she was sitting up more, talking to people, and for once, she was the talk of the town, and not about her new invention. Inquiring about her interests, pastimes, and whether she ever had time for leisure outside of the lab, the girls wanted to learn more about her. The conversation eventually returned to her creative mad scientist approach, though. Their intrigued looks changed to confusion as she began to go into great detail about her most recent concept. Mina tried to follow along, blinking and laughing awkwardly. Wow, that sounds complicated. Even though Momo only partially understood what Mei was saying, she nonetheless nodded in agreement. Yes, quite intricate, but maybe you could explain it a little slower. Ochako shook her head and laughed. Yeah, Mei, you lost us back at Jet Booster. Mei stopped in the middle of her statement, looked around the group, and realized she had rambled once more. Oh, oops, she grinned broadly and laughed it off. Guess I got carried away. The girls lingered and talked for a while, attempting to learn more about Mei in spite of her oddities. Even though her thoughts kept returning to Izuku and the days she was mentally counting down, she was making an effort to connect with her classmates for the first time. With her eyes sparkling with anticipation, Mina abruptly leaned in with a cheeky smile while the group carried on talking. So, Hatsume, I heard you confessed your crush to Midoriya. The others, obviously unaware of this development, turned to Mina with astonished eyes. Wait, what? Jiro cried, flicking his gaze from Mina to Mei. Since when? Mina pointed at Ochako with an even bigger smile. Ochako told me. Red in the face, Ochako raised her hands defensively. I'm sorry. Deku confided in me, and it just slipped out, I swear. There was a sudden buzz of curiosity in the room, and everyone's eyes were on Mei, who was completely undisturbed as usual. She brushed it off without skipping a beat and said, "Yeah, I'm in love with him. Told him after waking up." The girls' faces lit up like they were watching a romantic drama as they all screamed in delight. Mina clapped her hands together and almost sprung from her chair. "That's amazing. Oh my gosh, how did he take it? What did he say? Are you guys dating now?" Momo's calm exterior belied her obvious curiosity as she leaned in curiously. "Yes, what happened after you confessed?" Even Juro, who normally remained calm, was listening intently. "I can't believe I missed all of this." Mei, though, just cocked her head. "He said he needs some time to think about it." As the girls' ecstatic reactions grew more intense, everyone voiced their thoughts and recommendations. Suyu calmly remarked, "Oh, that's classic Midoriya, overthinking everything, as she usually does." Mina gave a little squeal. "That's adorable, he's totally going to say yes, right? I mean, he has to. You guys are, like, a perfect match." With a light-hearted tone, Toru said, "Yeah, you're super confident, and he's always so nervous, opposites attract." Momo, always the sensible one, gave her own counsel. "If you're truly serious about your feelings, then just be yourself. Don't feel like you need to rush anything. Give him the space to come to his own decision." Though the idea of dating advice was still unfamiliar to her, Mei listened to each of them and considered what they had to say. Even if she didn't fully understand the finer points, she enjoyed their enthusiasm. She gave a nod, but again her directness took over. "I don't really care about all that. I love him, and that's it. If he says yes, great. If not, well, I'll still keep studying him." Although they all thought Mei's sincere emotions were charming, the girls couldn't help but giggle at her direct honesty. "Well, whatever happens," Mina replied with a grin, "you've got our support. You and Midoriya make a pretty awesome pair." Ochako sat silently with a slight smile on her face while they kept swooning and giving Mei more advice, ranging from, "Just smile more," to, "Maybe don't scare him with tech talk." Even though she had feelings for Izuku of her own, she felt more at ease when she saw Mei so forthright and honest about her love for him. Ochako wheeled Mei out herself as she was eventually released from the hospital, and they strolled around the hospital's corridors, speaking amiably. Mei was in a good mood and was excited to return to her studio and work, but she was also excited at the possibility of meeting Izuku again, which she couldn't fully control. As they got closer to the hospital's entrance, Ochako broke the easy calm with a soft yet reflective voice. "Mei, there's something I've been meaning to tell you." Mei, who is usually self-assured, tilted her head curiously in Ochako's direction. "What is it? You're not going to tell me to stop talking about my babies again, are you?" Ochako shook her head and smiled softly. "No, nothing like that. It's about Izuku." This immediately caught Mei's attention. Ochako inhaled deeply before speaking softly and deliberately. "I had a crush on him once, you know. Back when we first started at UA. Mei didn't interrupt, but she blinked in mild astonishment. Ochako went on, her tone becoming more thoughtful. "It was a simple crush. Nothing special, really. He was kind, and he always tried his best, so I couldn't help but admire him. But, as time went on, and I got to know him better, I realized something." With a tinge of surprise still visible on her face, Mei listened carefully. Ochako looked at Mei with a faint, longing grin. "The more I got to know him," she shared, "the more I saw him as a really good friend. Someone I trust and care about deeply, but in a different way. I realized I didn't love him the way I thought I did. But, I guess that's why, when I saw you with him, I felt jealous. At first, anyway." Mei's eyes went wide with real surprise. "Jealous of me?" Ochako's eyes softened as she nodded. "Yeah, I mean, I didn't even realize it at first. You're so direct, so fearless when it comes to your feelings. It made me realize that I had to confront my own emotions." She laughed gently. "But now that I see how much you care about him, I feel like I can let go of whatever little feelings I had left." Mei remained silent for a while as she took in Ochako's admission. Although she wasn't accustomed to having such intimate discussions, she could sense that Ochako was telling the truth. Mei paused and then spoke, her voice unusually quiet. "I had no idea, I thought you were just a rival." Ochako grinned broadly at Mei's candor. She put a reassuring hand on Mei's shoulder and said, "No, not a rival. Not anymore." Her eyes were genuine. "Hold on to him, okay? And protect him, in ways that I can't." Deku's a strong person, but he needs someone who understands him, who can support him in more intimate ways than I ever will. A tiny, grateful smile pulled at Mei's mouth. I will. I'll make sure to protect him, and love him. That's all I could ever ask for, smiled Ochako in response. When Mei saw Izuku waiting for them in the entrance foyer, her heart skipped a beat. He stood there with a straightforward look of concern on his face, moving slightly on his feet as he always did. He could appear unremarkable to others, just another child in a sea of would-be heroes, but to Mei, he was flawless. She felt a surge of excitement and automatically rearranged her hair as her tummy flipped. He was no longer only a task or a riddle to be solved. She had a profound affection for him, someone she desired to spend time with. First to welcome Izuku, Ochako spoke in a light and amiable tone. Before leaving Mei and Izuku standing in the silent lobby, she waved to them both and said, "Hey, Deku. I'll go check on the cab, so I'll be right back." For a minute, there was an awkward quiet between them as neither of them knew what to say. As Mei remembered all the advice the girls had given her about approaching someone you liked, she felt her nervousness rising and her heart racing. Mei's voice was too excited, but she didn't care. "You're looking really good today, Izuku. I mean, you always look good, but today especially. Your hair, your face, everything," she blurted out, finally unable to contain herself any longer. Izuku's face immediately turned a deep shade of red as his eyes expanded. Clearly agitated by her unexpected compliment, he scratched the back of his neck. His cheeks persisted in burning as he stammered out, I mean, thank you. I'm not used to compliments like that." Mei grinned, content with her job. Sort of, the tips had worked. She couldn't have asked for more than to see him become so shy and ashamed. Her eyes were shining with love as she leaned forward a little. "It's just the truth, you know." Izuku gave her another look, still flushed, but with a tiny, sincere smile. Mei's heart skipped a beat when she saw the warmth in his gaze. And she felt a little bit closer to him in that instant. He knelt before Mei, his emerald eyes meeting hers with a gravity she had never seen in him. His closeness drove waves of warmth through Mei, causing her cheeks to flush rapidly and her heart to race. The anticipation was too much for her to handle, but she forced a frightened smile. Then Izuku smiled at her, a gentle, sweet smile that reached his eyes and eased the tension that had been there. His voice was low and earnest as he started talking. He said, "I've had time to think it through," while maintaining eye contact with her. As she waited for his next words, Mei's breath caught and her pulse pounded in her chest. Izuku went on, "I've always wanted to focus on being a hero," in a reflective tone that sounded almost like he was talking to himself. "Because that was all I ever knew. Nothing else mattered to me. Nothing else could matter. I was so determined, so focused on that dream." He looked away for a while, as though he needed to collect his thoughts, and then he looked back at her. His words were hushed. "But UA changed everything," he added. "It gave me the opportunity to chase my dream. But it also gave me friends, people who supported me when I thought I couldn't keep going. And it also gave me the blessing of meeting you." Mei's universe appeared to shrink to the two of them in that instant, and her heart missed a beat. Izuku went on, his voice soft, his face softening. He responded, "I'll admit, I'm just as clueless about love as you probably are," with a little laugh. "But there's one thing I know for sure, I want to learn more about it. And I'd love to experience it alongside you." As his words sank in, Mei's mind raced and her heart burst with excitement. The sounds she was hearing were so unbelievable. Her eyes grew wide, and she exclaimed, "So, does that mean you've accepted me?" In a high-pitched voice that was nearly too thrilled to control herself. Izuku grinned once more, the gentle, sweet smile that had warmed her heart so many times. "Yeah," he said quietly, his eyes gleaming with earnestness. "I think it's time for us to head back to the dorms, together." When Mei understood that this was actually happening, her cheeks brightened like never before and her heart leapt. Mei was still confined to her wheelchair, but her joy overcame her and she tried to stand out of instinct. Izuku, however, stepped forward and stopped her before she could even stand up by lightly resting his hands on the arms of her chair. Their eyes met without a word, and something happened between them, an unconscious understanding, a bond they had been gradually developing for a long time. The world faded around them as they leaned toward one another slowly and without hesitation. With their lips perfectly aligned, they enjoyed their first kiss in a gentle, sweet moment. It was tender and full of all the feelings they had been unable to communicate up until that point. Nothing else seemed to matter at that moment, and time appeared to halt. Despite his nervousness, Izuku felt a warmth that encircled them both as Mei's heart twitched wildly. Both of their faces were flushed, breathless, and filled with silent, mutual delight as they eventually withdrew. Mei's eyes glistened with pleasure as she paused to relish the unadulterated, strange feeling. She finally said, "Nice," with a broad smile on her face. Her exuberance was infectious, and they both started laughing, their happiness resonating through the silent hospital lobby. A new, stronger relationship was created between them when their laughter subsided and they were left grinning at one another. In the weeks that Mei and Izuku have been dating, their relationship has been nothing short of ideal. Their personalities blended together in a way that felt appropriate and natural, and their chemistry was evident. Mei's wild energy was counterbalanced by Izuku's quiet, contemplative demeanor, while her fervor and inventiveness stoked his own aspirations to become a hero. It seemed as though they had always been together since they had settled into a groove. Mei's workshop was a hive of fresh innovations, and her creative depression had finally subsided. She was much more energized than normal when Izuku was around, and she was always coming up with new ideas for devices that would benefit him and their pals. Mei found studying with Izuku to be an exciting and enjoyable experience, even though she didn't fully comprehend some parts of being in a love relationship. Mei cherished every moment of every new experience, whether it was a straightforward date, a peaceful moment spent together, or learning how to manage their emotions. Izuku, on the other hand, was as enthralled with the voyage they were on together and was patient and understanding. Neither of them would have desired a more joyful, enlightening, or supportive relationship. Mei treasured each and every time they shared. Her day was greatly improved just by the knowledge that Izuku was hers. It was as if her life force exploded with fresh vitality each time they kissed, held hands, or hugged. The warmth of his exclusive affection, which was simultaneously reassuring and thrilling, was what kept her heart going. Her days were brightened, her mind was sharpened, and her motivation was endless just by being close to him. Every hug felt like a shield of warmth and protection, and every kiss was like a spark that rekindled her creativity. Izuku was more than simply a boyfriend to Mei. He was her life partner, her muse, and the source of an unending supply of happiness that made her heart race. She found herself more motivated than ever, and she laughed and smiled more. She felt as though she could overcome anything when she was with Izuku. As long as he was with her, every idea, every obstacle, and every dream seemed feasible. Mei started to open up and become more gregarious because of Izuku. Her peculiarities and eccentricities were welcomed by the girls in Class 1A, and before she knew it, Ochako had become one of her closest confidants and friends. Even though it was outside of her comfort zone, Mei found herself embracing this new and unknown road. She was no longer satisfied with the isolation of her lab, but she now made more time for the people around her, even though her heart still belonged to her babies, her cherished inventions. Mei noticed that she was talking to the girls more frequently, finding humor in Mina's jokes, and even sharing technical curiosity with Momo at times. This new equilibrium between friendship and business was odd, but in a pleasant way. She had moved beyond mechanics and electronics. Mei had become slightly more conscious of the world outside her lab doors, but she was still intensely committed to her profession. Despite having friends and Izuku to enjoy the moment with, she remained the crazy scientist at heart. The scar that remained after Mei's stab wound had completely healed served as a continual reminder of the danger she had encountered. She couldn't completely get rid of the unnerving weight that Toga's ominous words had left in her head. Mei felt a mixture of terror and resolution whenever she recalled that almost fatal encounter. She had assured Izuku that she would never again let herself be taken by surprise. A fresh fire was stoked inside her by the idea of being powerless and unable to defend either herself or him. Mei started concentrating her creative genius on something more intimate, making protective gear that she could always wear or carry. Her inventions were no longer the only topic of conversation. She desired to be ready and powerful enough to protect Izuku as well as everything she had acquired. Mei promised to be prepared if Toga ever ventured back into her life. Nothing, not even Toga, could take away the life and love she had created with Izuku, and she would defend them. Mei was engrossed in her work in her lab, perfecting Bakugo's explosive gauntlets as the fiery future hero paced impatiently behind her. She was so accustomed to his frowning that it didn't bother her in the least. Bakugo moaned, crossing his arms, "Come on, Goggles, are you done yet?" Mei joyfully replied, "Almost there." Just need to tweak the pressure regulator, without raising her eyes from her work. How the hell did that Deku of all people manage to bag a girl? I'm still wrapping my head around that, Bakugo murmured under his breath after rolling his eyes. After a moment of hesitation, Mei's hand started to tinker again. Without looking back, she said in a tone that seemed entirely unconcerned, "Oh, you mean me?" Bakugo said, "Who else, Goggles?" With a sincere look of confusion. "It's just weird. I didn't think he had it in him. Are you either, for that matter? You're both nerds, just different types." As she tightened a screw, Mei laughed and a grin appeared on her face. "Yeah, I guess we are. But he's perfect, you know. Maybe that's why." Bakugo laughed. "Perfect, huh, sure. But don't expect him to save you from me if these gauntlets don't work properly, Goggles." At his usual threats, Mei laughed. "Don't worry, these babies will be just as explosive as you are, Bakugo. Maybe more." Bakugo murmured, his agitation barely concealing the tiniest trace of amusement. Yeah, whatever," he said. Mei consistently produced outcomes that even he couldn't dispute. Mei immediately focused on a new project, one that was more intimate, after Bakugo bounded out of her lab. Since Toga's attack, she had been working on a particular piece of technology that would protect her in the event that she was ever caught off guard again. The next time, she would not be left defenseless. The door creaked open as she was ready to start making the changes. With a tiny bundle in his palm, Izuku intervened. Before he could finish, Mei whirled in her chair and jumped into his arms, embracing him tightly. "Hey, Mei, brought you a snack," she said. "Izu," she said, her face beaming with joy. Even though it had only been a few hours, she held on to him as if she hadn't seen him in days. As best he could without dropping the luggage, Izuku returned the embrace with a loving smile. He laughed and placed the bag on the closest table, saying, "Whoa, you seem energetic today." She teased him, tightening her grip on him before releasing it. "I always am when you show up," she said. "What did you bring me?" Izuku opened the bag and took out a little package. "Just some of your favorite snacks. Thought you might need a break." Mei smiled as the small gesture made her heart expand. "You're the best." She snatched up the package and sat back at her desk, opening it and eating. Izuku observed her, somewhat intrigued by the strewn about parts and blueprints. After approaching to look at the jumble of drawings, he inquired, "What are you working on now?" Mei's face changed somewhat, and her tone became more solemn. "It's a new project. For me, you know, just in case something like the Toga incident happens again." Izuku scowled in worry as his smile dimmed. "Mei." She dismissed him with a wave. "Don't worry, it's nothing crazy, just something to help me defend myself. I promised you, right? I won't let myself get caught off guard like that again." Izuku groaned, still displaying concern, but he had faith in her. His hand rested lightly on her arm as he crouched next to her. "Just be careful, okay? I don't want to see you hurt again." Mei turned and smiled gently at him. "I will, and hey, you'll be there to save me if things go wrong, right?" "Always," Izuku assured her, giving her arm a gentle squeeze. Pulling Mei close, he put his arms around her from behind and rested his chin lightly on her shoulder. Leaning against him and experiencing the warmth of his arms made Mei's heart skip a beat. These were the times when everything seemed so right. He whispered softly, "I love you, Mei," his breath warm against her ear. Mei closed her eyes and smiled, allowing herself to be fully present. She whispered back, "I know," in a gentle and loving voice. "I love you too." As they remained in this close embrace, the world around them vanished, and they remained silent and happy. The act of being together, sensing each other's presence, and knowing that they had each other no matter what had replaced the words as the most important thing. Izuku leaned in and kissed her cheek tenderly, grinning. "How about we go grab some lunch? Just the two of us," he said. Mei blinked, balancing her extensive list of tasks against the possibility of lunch. She said, "But the babies," as she looked at her desk, which was piled high with unfinished projects. Izuku laughed at her usual way of thinking. "They'll be fine. You can take a break, right? Plus, I promise they won't go anywhere." Her internal conflict was evident as she cocked her head, but she was persuaded by his smile and the warmth of his touch. She gave up at last, "Fine," with a light-hearted twinkle in her eye. "I guess I can push back a few projects, for you." He gave her another laugh, and she kissed him on the cheek in response. "Deal." Let's go. Mei excitedly put her instruments aside, prepared to spend some time with him and away from the lab. Momo had recommended a small coffee shop just outside of UA, and Izuku took Mei there. Mei had to laugh to herself as they sat down. She would have arrived wearing her typical grease-stained shirt, totally unaware of fashion, had Ochako not reminded her. Even though Mei thought it was a little fussy, Ochako had made sure she looked good, even if she wasn't used to dressing up. Izuku ordered them a latte for him and a mocha for her, which she gladly accepted with a broad smile. As she sipped her drink, she pondered, I don't understand why people care about how we dress. As long as I'm comfy and can work on my babies, that's all that matters. Izuku shook his head slightly and grinned heartily. It's about balance, I guess. And, you look great today, Mei. His praise made her flush, and she was already starting to forget about the entire fashion thing. As she took another sip of her mocha, she smiled and said, thanks. I only care because it's with you. Still wearing her goggles and her trusty work boots, Mei had decided on a simple gray sleeveless top and a knee-length black skirt. In some way, the ensemble balanced her pragmatic disposition with a chic look that was ideal for her. As she joyfully sipped her mocha, Izuku couldn't keep his eyes off of her. The sunlight shining through the cafe's windows gave her a gentle glow. She smirked when she saw him gazing. She leaned forward a little and taunted, what? You checking out your girlfriend, Midoriya? Izuku scratched the back of his neck as he flushed. He said, I can't help it, in a quiet voice. You look amazing, Mei. Mei put down her cup and smiled happily. She gave him a grin, which made him giggle as they continued to savor their quiet time together. Well, good, I'm glad you're appreciating the effort. But next time, I'm showing up in my lab gear. Following their coffee meeting, Izuku took Mei for a leisurely stroll in a neighboring park. Mei pouted as they walked down the road, obviously wanting to return to her lab and concentrate on her babies. However, Izuku, grinning sardonically, performed what he dubbed boyfriend intervention, ensuring she did not spend the remainder of the day in the lab. Mei huffed and crossed her arms. You're conspiring with the others, aren't you? Ochako, Momo, they're all plotting to keep me from my work. With a laugh, Izuku drew her in close by the waist. Maybe, but you're always cooped up in there. I just want you to enjoy the world a bit more, outside of your lab. It's important to take breaks, and besides, he smiled as he looked at her, I love spending time with you. Despite letting out a big sigh, she couldn't help but smile. Leaning against him, she joked, fine, but only because I love being around you, too. This better be worth missing out on my projects, as they strolled on. Izuku grinned, pleased to see her unwinding. Though she would always be the crazy innovator he loved, Mei was gradually starting to embrace some balance in her life with his assistants and the girls of 1A. He understood it wasn't easy for her to overcome her isolated, unsociable habits. Mei and Izuku strolled through the park hand in hand, their talk flowing as naturally as ever. Mei talked endlessly about her most recent creation, explaining every minute aspect with unbridled passion. It's a fully automated gear system with a built-in feedback loop. Once it detects a malfunction, it self-repairs. Can you imagine the potential? Even if part of her technical stuff went beyond his head, Izuku listened with wide eyes and nodded in agreement. That's amazing, Mei. You could revolutionize support equipment with something like that. He responded by diving into his own enthusiasm, narrating the most recent news about pro heroes and examining their peculiarities. And hawks. He can control each of his feathers independently, it's incredible. He's so fast in the air, it's like he's always one step ahead of the villains. Mei smiled. I bet I could build something that would boost his speed even more. Imagine if he had a flight stabilizer attached to his back. Their common enthusiasm for their respective domains allowed for endless, captivating conversations as they moved fluidly between support tech and hero tactics. Because of how well their interests matched, they became closer and developed a special link that only they appeared to comprehend. Mei was in awe of the change that had occurred within her. Her lab and her innovations had been her life's work. Her babies served as her motivation and the impetus for all of her choices. However, she became aware of how easily her priorities had changed as she and Izuku strolled together, laughing and sharing ideas. She was astounded at how easy the straightforward yet deep act of falling in love could pull her away from her lifelong commitment to her career. Mei glanced at him and smiled slightly. I never thought I'd want to do anything other than invent, she said. But being with you, Izuku, it's like I've found something else just as important. Maybe even more. Izuku's smile was warm and comforting as he squeezed her hand. I feel the same way, Mei. You've brought so much joy into my life too. Suddenly, Mei felt calm, as she realized that her universe had grown beyond her machines, all because of this teenage kid who had captured her heart. Playfully, Mei bent down and gave Izuku a succession of tender kisses on the cheeks, one after the other. Izuku, who has always been shy about showing affection in public, reddened intensely yet grinned at her zeal. Come on, Izuku, she sulked, her dissatisfaction glaring at him. You're always holding back, gimme some kisses in return. Her big, expectant eyes were difficult to ignore, yet he stopped for a while, looking around anxiously. With a playful defeat sigh, he leaned in and planted a gentle kiss on her lips. The moment lasted, and Izuku, who was often bashful, felt more certain and gave her a sincere kiss in return. There, he said quietly, grinning at her while maintaining a slight flush. Happy now? Mei smiled, heart thumping. Very, she exclaimed as she leaned against him, relishing their intimacy and not at all concerned that they were in public. She was thrilled that Izuku was gradually opening up to her, and she was more than willing to help him do so. Mei and Izuku saw Denki and Kyoka ahead on the route as they carried on walking. Kyoka leaned down with her hands on her knees, recovering her breath but appearing far less exhausted than her partner, while Denki sat on the ground, gasping heavily and looking completely exhausted from the run. Happy to have run into them, the pair walked over. Between gasps, Denki yelled, "Hey, look who it is!" and waved when he saw them. Lovebirds on a stroll. Kyoka grinned while rolling her eyes. Hi, you two, she said, straightening up and dabbing at her perspiration. You guys out for a walk? When Izuku saw their classmates, they grinned broadly. To which he replied, yeah, just enjoying the day, what about you two? Training. Denki fell onto his back in a dramatic manner. Jiro's idea, he gave a moan. I'm dying, man. Kyoka smirked down at him while crossing her arms. You wanted to get better at keeping up in physical stuff, remember? This is part of it. Mei leaned closer to Izuku and giggled. Looks like we're not the only ones having fun outside today. Izuku nodded and laughed, adding, it's good to see everyone pushing themselves, though, he smiled encouragingly at Denki. In defeat, Denki waved his hand. Yeah, I'll catch up, in like 5 hours. Kyoka arched an eyebrow as she cocked her head to gaze at Mei and Izuku. So, you two got any plans for the weekend? Mina's been trying to set up an evening hangout in downtown. You two in? Thinking, Izuku scratched the back of his skull. I've got a few assignments to finish up, but I could probably make it if Mei's interested. But Mei appeared a little apprehensive, her head still racing with unresolved tasks from the lab. I don't know, I'm kinda behind on some schematics and upgrades for my babies. You know how it is. Kyoka smiled teasingly and leaned in to nuzzle her. Come on, you can't just live in the lab forever. It'll be fun to get out, hang out with the rest of us, and unwind for a bit. Izuku smiled encouragingly and squeezed her hand. You've been working really hard lately. Maybe it wouldn't be a bad idea to take a little break. Torn between her love of tinkering and spending more time with her pals, particularly Izuku, Mei pouted a little. As she looked at Kyoka, she said, well, I guess I have been working a lot, you're really sure it'll be fun? Kyoka smiled. Trust me, you'll have a blast. Mei looked curiously at Kyoka as she cocked her head. So, your boyfriend, she said, nodding to Denki, who was still laying on the ground, gasping for air, is he coming with you? He's not my boyfriend. Kyoka stammered, her face flushing rapidly, her voice cracking slightly as she revealed her discomfort. She looked aside and crossed her arms. Mei scowled, obviously struggling to comprehend Kyoka's denial. Mei nodded to herself as she began her investigation, but I thought you two were a couple. You have the same aesthetic, your quirks are pretty compatible, and you both like music and stuff. Plus, your personalities match perfectly. The data seems pretty solid in my head. Kyoka's face flushed even more, and she mumbled, it's not like that, her voice barely audible above a whisper. Izuku intervened, clumsily scratching the back of his neck. His smile was faint and contrite. Sorry about that, Jiro. Mei just has a unique way of looking at things, he said. Denki, meanwhile, stood up at last and wiped perspiration from his brow. What are you guys talking about? Kyoka gave him a fierce look and cut him off before he could continue the talk. Nothing. Just. Stop talking. Her cheeks were blushing as though she had taken in too much of his power, and she was still unable to meet his gaze. Mei kept a close eye on them while her analytical mind worked. Leaning in Izuku's direction, she said, I'm still sure they have a high percentage of strong compatibility. Izuku laughed uneasily, attempting to diffuse the tension. Why yeah, maybe, but let's, not push them, okay. With a cheeky gleam in her eyes, Mei turned to face Izuku as Kyoka and Denki sprinted off, still agitated by the conversation. She sprang onto his back before he could respond, putting her arms around his neck and grinning mischievously. With playful adoration in her voice, she urged, carry me, like a good boyfriend should. Startled for a moment, Izuku laughed softly and repositioned his hand to keep her steady. All right, he responded with a kind smile before starting to move once more. Mei's face lit up with happiness as she cuddled up against his back. For a minute, the breeze and distant conversation were the only sounds as the two of them walked through the park, her resting on his back. Mei felt safe and loved, and her heart grew with joy. Being carried by him was more than simply a game, it served as a constant reminder of how much she cherished being near him in every manner. She put her chin on his shoulder and said, You're too good to me, her smile never going away. Izuku smiled back, blushing slightly. I just want to make you happy, Mei. She said, You do, always, and tightened her grip on him as they strolled on, thoroughly enjoying each other's company. Momo and Ochako thought it was time to take Mei shopping because the weekend was coming up. Mei, on the other hand, had no idea what fashion was. She was far more interested in technology and electronics than clothes. However, the girls were committed to making her look amazing, especially for Izuku and not just for the night out. As they walked inside a hip boutique, Ochako taunted, Mei, you can't wear grease-stained clothes every time you go out with him. Mei scratched her cheek bewildered, her goggles still on her head. But they're comfortable, and I like how functional they are. Momo put a hand on Mei's shoulder and laughed. We'll help you find something just as comfortable, but maybe a bit more stylish. You want to impress Izuku, right? Mei shrugged after blinking. I don't think he minds what I wear, but, if it'll make him happy, I'll give it a shot. As the three of them went through the clothing racks, Momo and Ochako took out various ensembles and showed them to Mei, who initially didn't seem too excited. She eventually started to enjoy it, though, particularly once Momo clarified the usefulness of some of the ensembles. Momo grinned and continued, think of it like building one of your babies, Mei, you're creating a new look for a new experience. Mei's attention was eventually drawn to that. Okay, I get it. This is like crafting an outfit that maximizes efficiency and appeal. Alright, I'm in. Momo, the trio's undisputed fashionista, was having a great time. With the accuracy of an artist at work, she combined tops, skirts, dresses, and accessories to create dozens of different ensembles, ranging from casual chic to sophisticated evening wear. Mei, who was still in her infancy, just followed the crowd, changing into a new clothing every few minutes. Mei said, this one's a bit tight, as she walked out wearing slender trousers and a form-fitting shirt. Momo cocked her head, examining her intently. Momo tapped her chin carefully and pondered, well, it does draw attention to your figure. But maybe something a bit more relaxed would suit you better. While waiting outside the dressing rooms, Ochako kept herself entertained by perusing the more costly merchandise in the store. She sighed playfully at the items she couldn't buy as she stared at the price tags. She eyed a gorgeous luxury purse and mumbled to herself, geez, how does Momo shop here so casually? Mei reappeared wearing a loose-fitting, oversized sweater and leggings, but this time she was dressed more casually. She spun around for Momo and Ochako to see her smile instantly. This feels nice. From the other side of the room, Ochako exclaimed, that looks adorable. Izuku will love it. Momo gave a nod of approval. I think we've found a winner for one of your outfits, she said with a cheeky smile. It's comfortable, and it still looks stylish. But we're not done yet. Mei let out a moan. There's more. Momo looked at Mei's body as she stood in the changing room, taking off the sweater she had just tried on. Her gaze lingered on her chest for a moment before she casually complimented her. Momo added, you know, Mei, you have a really nice figure. We're about the same size, in a kind but a little shy tone. Same size, is that important? Mei questioned, twisting her head in curiosity. When Momo saw the turn her remark had taken, her cheeks turned red. Well, some guys, You know, they like that sort of thing. Mei, still perplexed, raised an eyebrow. Like what? Momo stumbled as she tried to gather herself. I mean, some boys pay attention to that, too, you know, chest size. Still perplexed, Mei blinked. Does Izuku care about that? Embarrassed, Momo waved her hands rapidly. I don't know, it's not something every guy cares about, but it's something people mention sometimes. I'm sure Izuku likes you for, all of you. Not fully understanding the commotion, Mei shrugged. If you say so, but I'm more concerned with how he likes my inventions, not my boob size. Right, of course, that's the important part, Momo said, laughing uneasily. Momo and Ochako were chattering cheerfully about their purchases as the three of them left the store with their shopping bags in hand. But Mei was still a little preoccupied, looking down at her new attire, since she was still getting used to dressing up for important events. However, the idea of doing it for Izuku motivated her to overcome the unfamiliarity. Mei gave Ochako a questioning glance as they strolled on. Are you sure you're not coming this weekend? She said. Ochako grinned and shook her head. Nah, I've got some different plans. But you all will have a blast. Unsure, Mei cocked her head. As she rearranged the luggage she was carrying, Momo added, so, who exactly is gonna be there again? It's going to be you, me, Mina, Jiro, Kaminari, Hiroshima, Todoroki, and Midoriya. Mei counted quickly in her head before her eyes brightened. Wait, that's an equal number of boys and girls. Is this a couple's date night? Momo laughed and waved it away. No, it's nothing like that, we're all just friends hanging out. No pressure, just fun. Nevertheless, Mei found herself thinking about the figures once more. It's just, with the way everyone's paired up, it kinda feels like one. Momo dismissed the worry with a smile. Trust me, Mei, it's just a casual get-together. No hidden couple agendas. Mei nodded slowly, but the idea was still in the back of her head. She wasn't positive it wasn't some sort of date night, but she would try not to think too much about it if Momo said it wasn't. Furthermore, she reasoned that she would enjoy herself regardless of the night's events if Izuku was present. Mei's mind kept racing, and she was powerless to stop it. She referred to Kaminari by her nickname, but seriously, don't you guys think Jiro and Sparky have a really strong compatibility? Momo and Ochako exchanged a knowing glance, both of them obviously thinking the same thing at one time or another. With a gentle chuckle, Ochako said, maybe, but let them figure it out. It's best not to intrude. Mei shrugged, still thinking deeply, but she soon turned her attention to her own predicament. Do you think Izuku will find me extra attractive in this? She wondered out loud after taking a quick look at the clothing that Momo had assisted her in choosing. Ochako gave a loving grin, absolutely, Mei. He already adores you, so with those clothes, you'll knock him out. Momo gave a nod of approval, you're going to look stunning. And knowing how much he cares about you, he'll be over the moon no matter what you wear. Mei smiled as she became more excited. I hope so. I mean, he's already seen me covered in grease and sweat, so this is a whole new experiment. The girls' laughter lightened the atmosphere as they assured Mei that she would definitely attract Izuku's attention that evening. Mei whispered to herself, I still don't get all this fashion stuff, when they were strolling. But if it's for him, I guess it's worth trying. Momo grinned broadly. Trust me, Mei, you'll look amazing, and Izuku will definitely notice. Ochako continued, yeah, and it's fun to try something different now and then. Mei nodded, but she was still thinking about the strange exchange from earlier. Her curiosity about what Momo had said persisted. Although she had always placed a high value on her innovations, she had never experienced this new aspect of her connection with Izuku before. Perhaps I should just ask him directly, Mei thought to herself as they kept walking. He's honest with me all the time. Indeed, I will simply ask Izuku his thoughts on breasts. Isn't that logical? Quote. Mei stood in the mirror, rearranging her attire while scrutinizing every element. Momo had chosen fashionable, well-fitting clothing, but for the first time in her life, she was unsure of how she looked. The feeling that she was overanalyzing everything, examining her mirror as if she were evaluating one of her creations, was odd. The notion of Izuku's response made her heart rush. Is he going to enjoy it? Was it excessive? Insufficient? She was more anxious than she had ever been in her life because he was the only one whose opinion mattered to her. She whispered to herself, I'm never like this, as she fidgeted with her goggles on her head. Why is this so hard? She was aware of Izuku's affection for her, but she began to doubt everything because she wanted to win his approval. In an attempt to calm herself, Mei inhaled deeply and reminded herself that he had always loved her even when she was at her messiest. This was about being herself, not about being flawless. All right, Hatsume, she said to her reflection, Izuku will adore it. You've got this. Feeling a little more confident, but still excited to see how he would respond, she picked up her boots and got ready to meet her boyfriend. With her heart racing in her chest, Mei went outside. She noticed Izuku standing there, looking even more dapper than usual thanks to his casual yet fashionable attire. His hair was styled well, and he exuded a serene assurance that caused her to crimson excessively. Even though she felt foolish and her mind was racing with fears, she couldn't help but be impressed by how well he saw her approach, his eyes brightening as he took in her beauty. Mei shifted uneasily, suddenly self-conscious in her high-heeled boots, black leggings, and beige pullover. It felt odd not to have the typical lab grime and oil sticking to her, and her hair was clean and styled for once. She felt exhausted since she was out of her zone, acting like she was someone she wasn't. Izuku smiled warmly and said, "Hey, Mei," his eyes wide with admiration. "You look amazing." Mei's heart skipped a beat as her face heated up even more. In an attempt to control her uneasy laughter, she bit her lip. She acknowledged, I feel ridiculous," as she pulled at the hem of her sweatshirt. "But, I'm glad you like it." Izuku took a step toward her and laughed quietly. "Ridiculous? No way. You look great, I mean it." She felt a little more at ease after hearing that. She grinned as she felt her stress release as she met his eyes. "Thanks, babe." He held out his hand, and she accepted it without question. The world appeared to disappear as their fingers entwined, and Mei felt genuinely relaxed for the first time that night. Mei's pulse pounded as she leaned in to kiss Izuku, delighted by the comforting familiarity of his lips against hers. She put her head on his chest, felt his heartbeat steady beneath her, and pulled him into a close hold after the kiss. Her arms around him with all the love she could manage as she surrendered into his embrace. "Do you think I'm pretty?" she inquired, tilting her head up with a teasing look. Izuku gave her a gentle smile as he peered down at her. "You're not just pretty, Mei. You're beautiful." His remarks caused her face to flush a deep scarlet, and she instinctively gave him another, more passionate kiss. Still a little shy, Izuku kissed her back and held her close. It was impossible for Mei not to feel proud of herself. Being called beautiful by him was more than she could have ever dreamed of, and every kiss and word he gave her filled her heart with joy. Izuku drew back a little and grinned uncomfortably as his face flushed. He stumbled, trying to think. We really should meet the others," he said. Still flustered from their kiss, Mei pouted at him, obviously not happy with the interruption. With a playful twinkle in her eyes, she said, "Can we kiss a lot afterward then?" Izuku turned aside and scratched the back of his head as his blush deepened. He murmured, embarrassed by her directness, sure." Mei leaned a little closer and grinned. She teased him more, asking, "Your place or mine?" Izuku stammered over his words and almost choked. I don't know. We'll figure it out." He stammered, obviously enjoying their light-hearted banter but also obviously overwhelmed by her audacity. Mei simply laughed, content with his response. With a victorious look on her face, she took his hand and dragged him along, saying, "Okay, then. Let's go meet the others." Mei and Izuku emerged from the taxi to find their pals waiting outside the bar and grill, the cold night breeze clinging to Mei's sweater. Mina was first to arrive, her normally vivacious demeanor elevated as she put an arm around Mei and smiled mischievously. As Mina looked at Mei's attire, she exclaimed, "Look at you. Mei, you look stunning tonight." Her eyes were sparkling. Mei felt a little unsteady due to Mina's delicate demeanor, especially because her eyes appeared to stay on her for a little too long. Thanks," Mei said, clumsily attempting to take a step back, her thoughts racing as she wondered in private whether this was how being too upfront affected other people. Fortunately, Jiro and Ajiro stepped in right away and pulled Mina away with a chuckle. Ajiro joked, "All right, Mina, give her some space." Jiro rolled her eyes. Jiro whispered, "You're making her uncomfortable," and nudged Mina away from Mei. Momo and Shoto waved everyone inside while standing calmly at the doorway. Momo said kindly, "Come on, let's go in and grab a table, it's freezing out here." As they approached the door, Izuku put his arm around Mei's waist. Mei's uneasiness vanished as she leaned into him and smiled softly as she felt his warmth against her. They entered the restaurant together, the warm ambiance enveloping them as they joined their companions for an enjoyable evening. The group was having a great time together, and the night was vibrant. As they compared notes on their progress, Izuku, Shoto, and Eijiro were discussing their recent hero training in great detail, their competitive nature evident. Mei, on the other hand, sat with the girls and listened to their stories and gossip. Naturally, Mina took the lead and jumped heartily into every small detail. At one point, Denki attempted to feed Jiro a piece of food while grinning playfully as usual. She flushed violently, and to Denki's astonished shriek, her humiliation swiftly transformed into a rapid kick beneath the table. The obvious tension between them was too obvious for Mei to ignore. After giving it some thought, she decided to keep silent and concentrate on her own lunch, keeping in mind her pledge to Momo and Ochako. Mei couldn't resist taking occasional glances at Izuku as she was eating, grinning to herself as he talked and laughed with the other boys. He was the one who caught her eye, even in a crowd, and the whole evening seemed better just by being close to him. For Mei, the evening was ideal, and the air was thick with the warmth of the group's friendship. She realized that being with Izuku, not merely being a member of the group, was what gave her a sense of warmth and belonging. With a cheeky smile, Mina interrupted the lively conversation at the table to inquire, "So, have you two gone past first base yet?" Mei squinted in perplexity, not knowing what the term meant. "What base?" Momo and Jiro rebuked Mina for her disrespectful inquiry right away, their faces flushed with humiliation. Still unable to understand the pink-skinned girl's query, Mei was in the dark. The other two apparently jumped her over it because it was so serious. Izuku looked worried and perplexed as he turned around. He noticed the abrupt change in the group's atmosphere and inquired, "What's going on?" Mei gave a shrug. "She asked me if we..." Momo grasped Mei by the arm and led her away from the table with a hard but gentle touch, her expression a mixture of humiliation and haste. Jiro trailed behind, staring at Mina disapprovingly. As Momo started to explain, Mina followed rather awkwardly, obviously attempting to hide the awkwardness of the situation. They located a more peaceful location away from the bar and grill's main area. "What's the big deal about it?" Mei said, still a little perplexed but intrigued. Anxious, Momo said, "Well, it refers to intimate aspects of your relationship, like your sexual lives. It's not something that should be discussed openly or pried into." When Mei finally understood, she responded honestly, "Oh, we haven't done anything, yet." Jiro was both relieved and a little ashamed, and Momo's eyes grew wide. Mei nodded, now seeing why the inquiry was so inappropriate, but she couldn't help but grin at the innocent miscommunication. Momo immediately attempted to save the day by saying, "It's important to keep those details private and not let others intrude on them." With a playful twinkle in her eye, Mina remarked, "Well, I can and will gladly give you some private lessons if you need any pointers." Clearly irritated, Jiro grabbed Mina's horns and remarked, "Stop it, Mina. That's not the time or place." Still agitated but attempting to be encouraging, Momo said, "Whatever you and Midoriya decide to do, it's your business and should be handled with care. Just make sure you're both ready and honest with each other about your feelings." Jiro looked away in shame and murmured, "Remember to be protected." Mei nodded, grateful for the guidance and the care shown for her welfare. Mei was comforted by her friend's understanding and support, but the talk returned to more light-hearted subjects. Mei turned back to the table and saw Izuku's red face and uneasy manner, which attracted her attention. He nodded shyly in greeting as she gave him a warm grin. Other than Midoriya's abrupt rigidity and Kaminari and Kirishima's cunning smirks, nothing seemed unusual. Jiro whispered, "What's up with Midoriya?" to Denki. Denki responded, "Oh, we just prodded Midoriya whether he and Hatsume have gone all the way in their relationship." Jiro rolled her eyes at the irony of the coincidence. Of course. The rest of the evening proceeded without incident, despite the uneasiness that had occurred earlier. Mei and Izuku made sure to emphasize the fun and companionship of the evening as the group relished their time together. Although it was still early in the evening, the group had made the decision to split up. Izuku and Mei chose to take a stroll through the peaceful streets and enjoy the refreshing night air as the others drove back home. As the temperature fell, Mei pulled herself close to him for warmth and gripped tightly to his arm. A few onlookers waved at them as they walked along the sidewalk, remarking on how cute and wonderful they looked together. Mei reveled in the praise, while Izuku, who was typically shy, flushed at the praise. She grinned almost mischievously as she gushed about her partner. She would add, "Isn't he the best? He loves all of my babies." And Izuku would stutter a bashful, "Thank you." The night was ideal, and the cool air just served to highlight how much they were warm to one another. Mei looked up at Izuku with a cheeky expression on her face as they joined arms. Still enjoying the attention she had received earlier, she asked, "So, do you think I should dress up more often?" Izuku shook his head a little and grinned. "I mean, you look amazing, but I love you for who you are. You don't have to change anything." Mei's sly smile turned into a sincere one. She answered, "I guess you're right," content with his response. They were still strolling when Izuku burst out laughing. He looked at her questioningly and remarked, "You know, you haven't mentioned any of your inventions the whole night." Mei halted, her eyes wide as though she had suddenly come to a terrible realization. "Oh no," she let out a cry. "I haven't. My babies must be missing me." She seized his arm in a desperate attempt to get him back to their dormitories. "I've been away for too long. They're going to malfunction without me." Knowing full well that she was still the brilliant scientist he had fell for, Izuku couldn't help but laugh at her inflated concern. He grinned and replied, okay. Let's go home then," pleased to see that the quirky Mei he loved was still there. As they made their way home, they accelerated their speed and shared a joke. Mei and Izuku had a friendly conversation as they walked to her hostel. Mei looked to him with a cheeky glitter in her eyes as they arrived at the door. She said in a playful yet earnest tone, "Hey, wanna come in?" Izuku's face turned scarlet at once, and he rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. He stumbled, obviously agitated, I think I should probably head back to my room." Never one to back down, Mei smiled cheekily at him. "Oh come on, don't forget, we promised to do a lot of kissing afterwards," she said, taking a small step toward him. He blushed more, but it was obvious that she was tempted. Izuku hesitated, though he wanted to. He glanced at her, obviously conflicted, and his words trailed off, I really want to be you." Mei laughed a little and shrugged, understanding his hesitation but not wanting to press him. Softly, "It's okay, Izu," she said. Before she withdrew, she leaned in and kissed him tenderly on the lips. "We'll save the rest for another time. Good night." Still apprehensive but appreciative, Izuku returned her grin. He said, "Good night, Mei," as he watched her slip away into her room. With a sigh of relief, he turned and walked back to his own room after standing there for a while with his heart pounding. Mei threw herself headfirst into her enormous stack of incomplete designs as soon as she entered her dorm room, her enthusiasm and vitality once more concentrated on her creations. With a desperate smile on her lips as her babies started to take shape on paper, she worked with precision while her hand gripped the pen tightly. Her mind was racing with incessant improvements and new ideas, and she was in her element. She was sketching her most recent concept when she abruptly stopped. Her eyes grew wide with insight. She looked down at herself and whispered, "Wait a second. I completely forgot to ask Izu about my boobs." Slumping over her desk in exasperation, she let out a groan. Mei let out a loud sigh and shook her head at herself, saying, how am I supposed to know if he likes them if I don't ask?" She smiled resignedly and grabbed up her pen once more. With a cheeky smile, she thought, "I guess I'll just have to ask him next time." Maybe during all of that kissing. Her energy swiftly returned as she turned back to her work. She stayed up quite late, but even though she was focused on her task, her thoughts wandered to regions she had never ventured to or even tried to investigate before. When she eventually made the decision to go to sleep, the ideas racing through her mind in the middle of the night were sure to provide her with some very enervating dreams. Mei's hands had been moving with practiced precision as she worked diligently on improvements for Izuku's hero suit. She had no problem mending his outfit, even if it looked to get battered throughout training. If anything, it was the ideal pretext for seeing him all the time, which complemented her love of innovation and the satisfaction of having him by her side. But now that his internship was approaching, she felt a flutter in her chest. She was genuinely apprehensive. It took Mei a time to identify the strange sensation as worry because she hardly ever felt this way. Izuku would encounter risks in the real world that were much more unexpected than those encountered during training. Her bow creased in intentness. "I can't be there to protect him, but I can make sure his gear does." Determined to provide Izuku the best technology available, she closely inspected the blueprints on her screen. Ideas were racing through her head. improved support boots, reinforced materials, and perhaps even some unexpected features he wouldn't anticipate. She said to herself, everything has to be perfect, her normally light-hearted smile becoming to a more solemn one. I'll make sure he's ready for anything. My babe is going to be the best-equipped hero out there. While sitting at her desk, Mei's thoughts strayed from the elaborate patterns of the hero costume to seeing Izuku in it, saving lives and kicking villains in the ass with his typical tenacity. Her eyes were dreamy as she let out an admiring sigh. She kept thinking about how powerful and capable he was, and how gorgeous he looked in his suit. Her mind continued to wander, remembering all the times she had measured him, her hands moving over his toned muscles as she touched him under the pretext of refining the suit. She bit her lip as the memory heated her body, and before she knew it, she was visualizing herself on top of him, enjoying his warmth and the irresistible intimacy. She tried to return her attention to her task by shaking her head a little, but the lovely daydream persisted. Knowing how much she enjoyed being near him, she mumbled to herself, "Focus, Mei." With a tiny smirk. But, yeah, I should probably ask for measurements again, just to be sure. Mei tapped her fingers anxiously against the workbench while furrowing her brows. Even while she loved Izuku's charming and passionate actions, she secretly wished for a little more closeness. Not that she was unhappy, quite the contrary. She had an unending love for him and treasured every kiss and delicate time they spent together. There was always that glimmer of hope, though, that perhaps this time he would let his hands stay a bit longer or their kiss would be more intense. She was rather annoyed by the idea. He was always very cautious and respectful. She wished he would have the courage to approach her a bit more boldly. Now frustrated, she attempted to return to her task, but her mind was deceiving her. She was reminded of him by everything, including his smile, his grip, and the feel of his lips on hers. As her imagination raced with visions of what might be and what she desired, her fingers stumbled on the tools before her. "Focus, Mei," she clenched her fist and hissed. "These inventions won't finish themselves." However, despite her best efforts to focus, her heart kept bringing him back into her mind, leaving her helplessly engrossed in her love for him. Mei let out a long sigh, gasping for air as she muttered Leku's name. With obvious frustration in her voice, she whispered to herself, "Why won't you just treat your girlfriend to some sweet, hot alone time?" Her mind would not let go of the thought, and her body grew stiff as her thoughts continued to wander. She rubbed her thighs together and bit her lip as the heat grew inside of her. The deeper intimacy that comes from knowing someone loved you so much that they couldn't keep their hands off you was what she yearned for, not simply the physical connection. She loved Izuku's kindness, but she was going mad since there wasn't a bolder move. As she sat back in her chair and gazed blankly at her latest creation, her hands trembled a little. With a mixture of affection and frustration, she asked herself, why does he have to be so respectful? He showed her his love in 1,000 ways, so she knew he cared for her, but she couldn't help but feel that they were keeping something from her that could deepen their bond. With her body still restless and her mind still racing, she traced patterns with her fingers absently on the workbench. "I want him." As the knowledge hit, Mei's heart began to race and her breath became labored. She could no longer deny the anguish that burned through her body, as if it were burning from the inside out. As her thoughts continued to whirl, she shifted uneasily in her stool and felt the puddle of heat in her lower tummy. With her face hot and her knuckles whitened from holding on to the edge of the workbench, she wondered, is this what Momo was talking about? Mei had always been pragmatic and had been preoccupied with her innovations, but now she was totally distracted. She realized now that the idea of Izuku was simply intensifying her lust. She tried to wish the feeling away by biting her lip hard and closing her eyes, but it wasn't working. The need for him consumed everything. Their soft kisses were no longer sufficient. Her body was wailing for more, and she needed more. Her voice was strained with want as she moaned softly, "Damn it, Izuku." It was the height of Mei's frustration. Even though she treasured every kiss and embrace they had, the months-long relationship wasn't enough to satiate the rising yearning that had been developing inside of her. He would blush and pull away each time she gently encouraged him to let his hands roam or to intensify their kisses, maintaining a careful and polite familiarity. She didn't want gentle tonight, though. She desired him completely. The warmth of his embrace and the shadow of his previous touch were still palpable to her. She longed for more. She moaned his name quietly, her lips quivering with want and her breath heavy. Her voice was rough with want as she muttered, "Why won't you just take me already, Izuku?" She couldn't stop thinking about what it would be like if he stopped being cautious and bashful and finally touched her the way she wanted him to. Her body ached from longing, and the fantasies made her heart speed. She clamped her thighs together and leaned forward on her workbench, her legs shaking. She wanted to find a way to decompress, but he was the one thing that would really satisfy her. The idea of spending time with him alone and feeling his hands on her made her tremble with excitement. Mei grasped herself without thinking, lifting her shirt to reveal her bra and feeling the warmth of her skin. Her fingertips touched the cloth, and she let herself enjoy the sensation for a second, pretending it was Izuku's hands rather than her own. She let out a quiet moan as the feeling caused her heart to beat. She couldn't stop thinking about what it would be like if he were here, his hands caressing her with the same tenderness and passion she frequently experienced during their kisses. She gave herself a little squeeze as her thoughts drifted further into her fantasy, hoping that soon, Deku would be the one to satisfy her barely controlled cravings. Mei's breath grew labored as she threw herself into the moment, her other hand sliding down inside her cargo pants. Her senses were overtaken by the need she had been repressing for Izuku as her hormones rose. Her body reacted enthusiastically to the sensation as her mind conjured up vivid images of him, his warmth, his touch, the way he made her feel both safe and wanted. Lost in the depths of her thoughts, her body shaking with a longing she had never felt so strongly before, she whispered his name once more. Waves of sensation ran through Mei's body as her fingers lightly stroked across her intimate area, causing her breath to catch. Her breast was still being massaged by her other hand, intensifying the intense feelings she was feeling. Her voice was barely above a quivering breath as she spoke Deku's name with a carnal, desperate longing. The urge to feel his hands on her, his body against hers, and the longing she had suppressed for so long all over her mind was all she could think about. Pure, unadulterated want drove her body's reaction while her mind raced. With thoughts of Izuku and the intimacy she desired swirling in her mind, Mei's heart pounded as she gave into the waves of her need. Her surroundings faded into the background as she concentrated only on the sensations rushing through her body, making each breath feel heavier. Izuku, she muttered, the words slipping out of her mouth like a prayer, a need for desire and connection. Her desire drove her fingers to move with eagerness, and every touch stoked a fire inside of her that she had no idea could burn so fiercely. All of the uncertainty around their relationship vanished at that instant. She was thrilled by the intensity of her feelings for him and embraced her impulses, feeling both powerful and vulnerable. She lost herself in her thoughts, picturing Izuku beside her, his kind smile and those comforting, loving, and understanding eyes. How would it feel to be there with him, to share this moment, to go into this new world with him? Her senses were further stimulated by the fantasy. However, a glimmer of doubt appeared among the intensity of the situation. Would he comprehend? Would he be prepared? She felt prepared. Her lab door swung open with a loud thud just as her fingers touched her most sensitive region, threatening to cause her to groan aloud. "Hey, Mei, you in here?" Ochako's dazzling voice pierced the atmosphere like a lightning strike. As though she had been electrocuted, Mei yanked both of her hands up to her chest and virtually leapt out of her chair. She squeaked, her eyes wide with surprise. "Wha?" Now, for a completely different reason, her heart was beating even more rapidly. As she whirled in her seat, she noticed Ochako standing in the doorway, her normally upbeat face rapidly changing to one of bewilderment. As she observed Mei's agitated, red face and her uncomfortably seated posture, Ochako raised an eyebrow and inquired, "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Mei's cheeks were burning with shame as her mind raced to think of a reply. Ochako was here, totally unaware of what she had just disrupted, and she had just been doing something she had never even thought about before. In an attempt to appear natural, Mei cleared her throat and fumbled hurriedly with some tools on her desk. Her voice was a bit too high-pitched as she rambled, "Oh. Yeah, totally fine. Just, deep in thought. About inventions. You know, the usual." Ochako squinted, obviously not convinced, but dismissed it. "Oh, okay, I was just coming by to see if you wanted to grab something to eat. You've been cooped up in here all day." Desperate to shift the conversation, Mei gave a forceful nod. "Yeah, food. That sounds great. I could definitely use a break. I've been, working really hard." Ochako grinned, but she continued to give Mei a dubious look. "You sure you're okay? You look super flustered." With a dismissive sweep of her hand, Mei attempted to fake a smile. "I'm fine, just focused. But yeah, food sounds great. Let's go." Mei exhaled shakily as they exited the lab, her thoughts still racing from the near miss. She wasn't prepared to share her thoughts or actions. Mei had been pacing back and forth in her dorm room with her fists clenched hard at her sides for a few days after that awkward encounter with Ochako. She had lost all of the spark that usually kept her excited and positive despite defeat. Rather, she was furious. She had set off another explosion in the laboratory earlier that day. That wouldn't have disturbed her normally. Explosions meant progress and were almost a part of her process. However, the harm had been too great this time. The instructors had finally had enough after she ruined half of the lab's equipment. She had been blacklisted, prohibited her from using the lab, until further notice. It seemed like the worst kind of insult, a direct hit to her identity. Her playground and haven was the lab. She felt imprisoned without it. She paced more quickly as fury tore at her, growing more and more angry the more she considered it. She muttered, "This is so stupid," as she reached for a wrench on her desk and twisted it in her hands, seemingly directing her rage into the icy metal. It wasn't even that bad. I've made bigger explosions before. The face still flushed with annoyance, she threw the wrench away and slumped down on the bed. This kind of anger was new to Mei. She was isolated, odd, and sure by nature, but she hardly ever let things bother her. Failure was merely a necessary step in the process. Being shut out of her own world, however, felt intimate. They seemed to be penalizing her for doing what she was greatest at. She tried to relax herself by tapping her foot on the floor, but it didn't work. Her mind was racing with all the ways she could have improved and secured her invention, and she was too wound up to stop the explosion. Now, however, none of that mattered. The idea was making her go crazy, and she felt stuck, disconnected from her job. Damn it! She rubbed her temples and moaned. What am I supposed to do now? Without the steady hum of machines and the scent of metal and oil that typically surrounded her, the dorm room felt too small and too silent. She felt lost without her offspring and without her innovations. She was troubled by more than simply the ban. It was the sense of worthlessness. And Mei couldn't stand that at all. Her wrath boiled to the surface more and more as she considered it. She got back up and paced, her thoughts racing. She wasn't truly upset with the instructors. She was upset with herself. She was aware that if she had been more cautious and concentrated, she could have prevented the explosion. She detested the fact that her thoughts had been straying in previously unheard of ways lately. She was the one slipping, not just the inventions. She kept thinking about Izuku and how preoccupied she had been ever since their friendship began to grow. Her feelings for him were becoming more complex and intense, which was making her less effective. Her mental state has been unstable ever since she did the thing with her hands, and it cost her time at the lab today. Mei sighed in frustration and sank back on her bed, gazing at the ceiling. She mumbled, "This is so stupid," once again. She wasn't used to being so vulnerable and out of control. She was becoming irritated with it. Mei muttered to herself as she quickly swiped her phone out of her pocket and scanned the screen. She hardly ever used her phone for anything than taking notes or checking specs, but she needed Izuku right now. She needed someone to talk to, someone who wouldn't criticize her for being off balance lately or for her problems. And her boyfriend is the best. He was always able to soothe her, and she was in dire need of it at the moment. For someone like Mei, she rarely displayed weakness, yet her text was succinct and direct. "Come to my room. I must speak." Glancing at the screen, she tapped her foot impatiently and pushed submit, hoping he would respond more quickly. She could feel her need for him increasing every second, and her annoyance was like a ticking time bomb. She wanted him here, and it was no longer simply about letting off steam, alongside her. Right now. A minute later, he finally responded, and she grabbed the phone to read it. "I'm on my way. In a few minutes, be there." With a harsh exhale, Mei threw her phone onto the bed and got back up, pacing like an animal in a cage. Not like her, she felt particularly needy. She wasn't the kind to depend on other people to console her emotionally, but today was different. She needed him to ground her, and she wanted him here. She became restless with anticipation. What she would say, how she would explain the ban and the explosion to him, and how she felt like she was losing control of things were all racing through her head. But there was also a gentler, more sensitive side of her that just wanted to be held, to feel his arms about her. She detested being thus needy, yet she was unable to get rid of it. She paced more quickly and murmured, "Where is he?" With increasing irritation, she tapped her foot on the floor. She blamed herself for wanting him here so much, and every minute seemed to drag on forever. She wasn't usually this reliant on other people. Izuku, however, wasn't just anybody. She knew she would feel better once he got here because he was her lover. When he was around, she always did. Izuku heard the muted sound of something hitting fabric by the time he approached Mei's door. After a brief moment of hesitation, he opened the door to discover Mei frantically using a screwdriver to puncture her pillow, her face contorted in exasperation. It was a bit frightening to see, but since I knew Mei, this was just her way of letting it all out. "Mei," he said as he hurried into the room. "What are you doing?" He stopped her mid-stab by gently grabbing her wrist without losing a beat. For a moment, it appeared as though she was about to lash out, or toss the screwdriver, when her eyes locked with his. Instead, with a quiet clatter, Mei dropped the screwdriver onto the bed as her body went suddenly limp. Izuku said gently, "What's wrong?" in a worried tone. Mei launched herself at him and wrapped her arms tightly around his torso before he could speak another word. She put all of her weight on him and buried her face in his chest. Izuku gave a startled blink, but he soon recovered and gave her a tight, comforting embrace. She held to him firmly, almost as if she were frightened to let go, and whispered, I'm so pissed. Against him. The lab, the explosion, they banned me, babe. Can you believe that?" Izuku's face softened as he held her close and laid his chin lightly on top of her head. She leaned into him with all of her strength, and he could feel the tightness in her body and her frustration. Mei was the one who usually charged ahead, full of enthusiasm and energy, but today she felt almost fragile. "I'm sorry, Mei," he whispered softly while slowly massaging her back. "That sounds awful. I know how much the lab means to you." He felt her hold tighten as she complained of something incomprehensible against his chest. She said, "I don't know what to do," with a little crack in her voice. "I'm just so mad, and it's all because I screwed up. I can't stand feeling like this." Her vulnerability made Izuku's heart hurt, so he held her a little tighter. It was heartbreaking to witness Mei in such distress, as he hardly ever saw her like way. "You didn't screw up," he said in a whisper, attempting to comfort her. "You've always taken risks, and that's part of why you're such an amazing inventor. Sometimes things don't go as planned, but that doesn't mean you've failed." Not quite convinced, Mei huffed. I don't feel like myself right now. It's like everything's slipping, and I don't know how to fix it." Izuku brushed a few flyaway hairs from her cheek and leaned back a little to gaze down at her. His words were soft. "You don't have to fix everything by yourself, Mei," he whispered. "I'm here. You can lean on me when things get tough, okay?" Her annoyance was still evident as she gazed up at him, but something softened in her eyes, as if his words had somehow gotten through to her. She muttered, "Thanks, Izuku," in a softer tone. I guess I've just been too wrapped up in my head lately." He gave her another comforting grip while grinning subtly. "It's okay. Everyone has days like that. But I promise, everything's going to be okay. You're still the brilliant Mei Hatsume." Mei's lips curled into a tiny smile for the first time since he had come. With a deep sigh, as though finally letting go of some of the tension she had been holding inside, she gave him a slightly tighter hug. "I really needed you today," she said quietly as she put her head back on his chest. "And I'm always here when you do," he said in a whisper while embracing her. Tilting her head upward, Mei immediately put her lips to Izuku's. The emotions she had been suppressing were released in a quick but gentle kiss. After blinking in astonishment, Izuku relaxed and gave her a gentle kiss in return, allowing her to dictate the pace. He understood her aggravation and her need for solace, and he was more than happy to support her in any way she required. Mei's fists gripped the fabric of his shirt when they finally separated, and she looked up at him determinedly. "You're not leaving," she stated firmly, in a quiet yet determined voice. "Not until I feel better." Izuku's laugh was comforting and warm. "I wouldn't dream of it," he said, stroking her face with his thumb and grinning softly. "I'll stay as long as you need me." Mei dragged him toward the bed after being pleased with his response, and they sat down together. They were silent for a moment. The quiet, serene silence between them seemed to dispel the anxiety that had been hanging so heavily on Mei. She was pulled into Izuku's lap and placed on his chest as he put his arms around her. He ran his fingers through her pink hair in a soothing, rhythmic way as he caressed it. Mei sighed contentedly as her body gradually loosened against his, her head resting against his shoulder. Mei felt her frustrations gradually ebbing away as the room's soft hum filled the gap between them. The fact that she needed him, had escaped her notice. In ways she couldn't describe, Izuku's presence calmed her frantic nerves like a balm. Mei closed her eyes and whispered, "You always know how to calm me down," as she relished the sensation of his hands in her hair and the steady rise and fall of his breathing. The ban, the explosion, and the lab no longer mattered to her. Being with him was all that mattered at the moment. Izuku gave her head a gentle kiss while laughing once again. He mumbled, "I'm glad," as he squeezed her in his arms. "I just want you to feel better." For what seemed like hours, the two of them sat there without exchanging words. The warmth of their hug did more than words could, and the quiet was sufficient. Normally so boisterous and vivacious, Mei found solace in the silence, her annoyance melting away. With a satisfied sigh, she leaned closer to him. She said, "You're not just some nerd, you know." In a light-hearted yet loving tone. "You're my nerd, and I love that about you." Her comments caused Izuku to flush, but they also made his heart feel warm. "And you're my amazing inventor," he said quietly, squeezing her. "I love that about you too." Mei grinned as the last of her rage finally subsided and was replaced by a sense of peace that had been missing all day. She felt calm as she was held in Izuku's arms, knowing that he would always be there to support her through difficult times. Mei gazed up at Izuku with a playful twinkle in her eyes, feeling totally at ease in his embrace. She whispered, "Hey, babe," in a gentle yet fun tone. He asked, continuing to run his fingers softly into her hair. Her tone was light yet curious as she said, "How much do you love me?" Izuku grinned and gave her a tender glance. He said without hesitation, "Plenty," in an honest tone. "Plenty?" she asked again, arching her brow. "That's not good enough. Say it." A little taken aback by her request, he blinked but laughed. "Say what?" "That you love me," she said, teasingly grinning. Izuku reddened a little, but he was glad to give in to her. "I love you, Mei." Her smile widened. "Again, I love you," he murmured, looking into her eyes with a smile. "Once more," she demanded, her smile growing more loving. He said it again, "I love you, Mei Hatsume," and this time his voice was even softer and cozier. His comments made Mei's heart skip a beat, and she instinctively moved in to plant a long, passionate kiss on his lips. They connected slowly and intimately this time, with no hurry or sense of pressure. Using both hands, she clasped his face, her lips moving in perfect unison as her fingers traced the shape of his cheekbones. She settled comfortably on Izuku's lap as he grabbed her waist with a hard yet gentle grip. He could sense the warmth of her skin leaking through her clothing and the softness of her body against his. His heart pounded, but it wasn't because he was nervous, rather, it was because he loved her so much. As they both lost themselves in the moment, the kiss grew deeper and lasted longer than the first. Mei's thumbs caressed his cheeks, her thoughts blissfully free of fear or frustration. Everything felt good in that instant. With their lips still tingling from the kiss, Mei placed her forehead against his as they eventually separated, both of them a little out of breath. Her heart felt light and joyful as she smiled softly. "I love you too, you know," she said in a gentle and earnest tone. Izuku tightened his arms around her waist as his smile grew. He muttered back, "I know," his eyes glowing with love for her. Mei felt totally relaxed for the first time that day. Now that she had Izuku by her side, everything else felt so trivial. Right then, she needed him more than she needed the lab or her ideas. With a sudden sense of confidence, Mei gave Izuku another, more passionate kiss. With a renewed fervor, she pressed herself closer, her lips pressing against his. She abruptly gave him a gentle backward shove until his back struck the mattress. Izuku gasped in astonishment, but he didn't fight back since he had total faith in her. Mei straddled his waist and got on top of him as he lay beneath her, leaning down to give him a deeper kiss. Her hair draped over them like a veil, concealing their faces from the public. As they kissed with an almost desperate intensity, the pink strands brushed across his skin and cascaded down his face. As she leaned toward Izuku, his hands automatically found her waist once again, his hold powerful but tender. Through her clothing, he could feel the warmth of her skin and the weight of her body against his. The way their lips glided together, each kiss more passionate than the last, was irresistible. As their kisses intensified, Mei's hands drifted up to cup his face, her fingers tangled in his untidy green hair. As her need for him increased, she could feel her breath coming in shorter spurts and her heart thumping in her chest. An overpowering yearning to be near him, closer than they had ever been before, appeared to take the place of her previous frustration, and every part of her seemed to hum with electricity. Izuku quickly replied, his own heart pounding as their lips repeatedly touched, despite being a little taken aback by Mei's unexpected ferocity. Her passionate kisses touched something deep within him, and he returned the favor with equal fervor. It was as though the outside world vanished, leaving only the two of them entangled and absorbed in one another. Mei drew back for a time, pressing her forehead against his as they both struggled to catch their breath, her breath catching a little. Their world shrunk to the two of them in that private room, her hair still draped over them like a veil. "Izuku," she said in a frantic, emotional tone, "I don't ever want you to leave." Reaching out to tuck a lock of her hair behind her ear, he smiled up at her, his gaze gentle and loving. He returned the whisper, "I'm not going anywhere, Mei," in an equally loving tone. Feeling the urge to address their position, how Mei was straddling him, how unexpectedly intimate and close everything felt, Izuku opened his mouth to speak. However, Mei silenced him before he could say anything more by lightly pressing a finger to his lips. A different type of thrill, one that was much more intense and personal, now filled her eyes, which were normally wide with enthusiasm for innovations and tinkering. She glanced down at him with a strange face as she leaned back up, still sitting on his waist, her hands on his chest. Deku hadn't seen her like that before. She was sensual, purposeful, and full of an interest that made his heart race. Without saying a word, the air between them felt heavy and charged with something they both recognized. Izuku felt the tension in the room and the weight of her body as he peered up at her, his eyes flickering with nervous excitement. The heat that radiated from her awakened something deep inside of him that he wasn't quite sure how to deal with. But he did not retreat. An unspoken understanding that they were about to cross a threshold that neither of them had ever crossed before permeated their sense of expectancy. The change in their relationship, the way her body reacted to being this close to him, and the way his hands had naturally settled on her hips despite his unsure expression were all things Mei could sense. Her eagerness was fueled by the intense attention in his eyes, which delighted her in a way she hadn't anticipated. He was nervous, but she could also feel that he trusted her. For a minute, neither of them moved, the only sound in the silent room being their breathing. Who would initiate contact? That wordless challenge hovered between them like a weighted question. Who would encourage them along this course? As Mei watched him, her fingers idly following patterns on his shirt, her heart thumping in her chest. Though she didn't want to rush, her mind was racing with potential solutions. She wanted him to feel equally eager and prepared. They both understood what was happening and what they were about to do, and the tension between them was evident. Izuku's eyes never left hers as his hands slightly tightened around her waist. He had the impression that he was standing on the brink of something that he desired but was unsure how to accept. Nevertheless, he was aware that they were each waiting for the other to decide. Mei's lips were just above his as she leaned forward a little. "Izuku," she said, her voice gentle yet brimming with the same erotic fervor. "Do you love me?" she asked. He nodded without hesitation as his heart skipped a beat. Whispering back, "I do," he swallowed the knot in his throat and spoke in a scarcely discernible voice. Her fingers brushed the hard muscles of Izuku's abdomen as her hands slipped beneath his shirt. Her eyes widened in admiration as she carefully raised his shirt higher, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath her touch send a chill down her spine. She had always appreciated Izuku's commitment to becoming a hero and knew he worked hard, but witnessing the tangible results of that effort up close was a whole new experience. The warmth of his body beneath her hands grounded her, and for the first time, she allowed herself to fully appreciate how much he had changed and grown, not just as a person, but also physically. Her breath caught as she showed off more of his toned torso, her fingers following the distinct lines of his abs with a mixture of need and curiosity. Physical attraction was not something Mei had ever focused on. Her thoughts had always been filled with devices, innovations, and the never-ending potential for advancement. However, she was now really appreciating the artwork in front of her, with Izuku sprawled out beneath her, his shirt pushed up to show off his well-earned muscles. Admiration for everything he had done to become the person he was more important than mere attractiveness. As she moved her hands over his chest, she could feel his breathing rising and falling beneath her fingers. With a voice full of wonder, she whispered, more to herself than to him, "I never realized. You're amazing." At her remarks, Izuku's face became a deep scarlet, and he felt both flattered and vulnerable by the intensity of her gaze. This was not how he was used to being viewed, particularly by Mei. Her intelligence, her eccentricity, and her relentless need to create were the reasons he had always admired her. Now, however, he was overcome by her admiration for him with the same intensity. Izuku struggled to regain his breath and managed to mutter, "I didn't think you noticed stuff like this," in a voice that was almost audible above a whisper. Mei's lips curled into a mischievous smile as she looked up at him. I usually don't, she said, continuing to feel the planes of his chest with her fingers, but right now, I can't help it. Her hands continued to rest on his abs, giving him a warm rush. It was more than just the physical bond, it was the understanding that she had a different perspective on him and was attracted to him in other ways. He felt both vulnerable and very close to her because of the admiration in her gaze. For once, she was more interested in him than in the devices or concepts circling around in her head. And his heart raced even faster at the mere concept. Once more, Mei moved in to plant a gentle kiss on his chest, her breath warm against his skin as her lips brushed his. She muttered, "You really are something, Midoriya," in a voice that was both excited and kind. She moved with a confidence that was all her own, her heart thumping in her chest and excitement coursing through her veins. This was the moment she had been anticipating for days, the one in which she and Izuku would further their relationship. However, a soft touch stopped her before she could raise the cloth. Izuku said, "Wait," and got up from the bed they had been lying on just a second before. With reluctance, she left him and sat facing him on her knees. His eyes darted away in embarrassment, and his face was flushed. Mei glanced at him bewildered and blinked, her excitement waning. Her tone was a mix of astonishment and displeasure as she asked, "Huh? What's the matter, babe? You trust me, right?" Izuku gave a brief nod while grinning sheepishly and massaging the back of his neck. "I do, Mei, I trust you, I think we should be safe about it." Mei cocked her head and looked at him incredulously. Safe? How? Her mind, which was constantly preoccupied with technology and mechanics, found it difficult to understand what he meant in this particular situation. Izuku squirmed uneasily on the bed as his cheeks turned even redder. Well, neither of us have any, protection. Like, condoms, or birth control. For a brief period, the words lingered in the air, and Mei's forehead furrowed as she attempted to comprehend his words. A brief series of calculations ran through her thoughts, something involving biology, danger, and the likelihood of unforeseen repercussions. Although the idea wasn't completely new to her, she had never given it much thought until today. "Oh," she said as she hesitated, her fingers immobilized on her shirt hem. "Oh." When she finally realized the consequences, a light bulb went off in her mind. Right, that makes sense, kinda. Her initial exhilaration subsided as the situation's realism set in, and she looked at him for a moment. She let out a little sigh of disappointment as her lips formed a narrow line. "I didn't even think about that." With his heart thumping in his chest, Izuku shot her a pitying glance. He truly didn't want to let her down, but he also understood that it wasn't the appropriate thing to jump into things without thinking through the repercussions. Not for either of them. He gently responded, "I'm sorry, Mei," and extended his hand to grasp hers. I want to make sure we're prepared, you know. I want it to be special, and I don't want us to worry about anything afterward." Before turning back to face him, Mei sat quietly for a while, tinkering with the hem of her shirt. His concern, his shame, and his concern for her were all genuine, and she could see it in his eyes. He had no intention of spoiling the occasion. He wanted it to go as smoothly as possible. "Special, huh?" Mei mumbled, looking thoughtfully and bending back a little. "I suppose you're right." The tension in the room began to subside as he looked her in the eye and smiled gently. "I promise, next time, with better planning, it'll be better." As she processed what he had said, Mei's prior displeasure subsided and she grinned. She laughed and leaned forward to jab him in the breast, saying, "Better planning, huh? You better keep that promise, Midoriya, or I'll hold it over your head for the rest of your life." Izuku chuckled uneasily, yet they now had a mutual understanding and a feeling of comfort. "I will." Mei smiled and leaned over to give him a little peck on the lips. Although it wasn't the intense, flaming kiss she had in mind, there was a distinct warmth about it. "All right, babe, you've got yourself a deal." Mei's hand remained on his cheek for a moment longer as they withdrew, and then she let go. "But don't think you're off the hook. We're definitely revisiting this later." Izuku nodded despite his face turning red once more. "I'll make sure I'm ready." Mei smiled, the spark she always had back. "Good. Now, since we're not doing that today, wanna help me test out a new baby I've been working on?" Izuku nodded, the tension completely gone now, and laughed. "Of course." As Mei headed toward the training fields, the sun was high in the sky, and she was thinking about the question that had been bothering her since yesterday. She was a genius in the realm of innovation, but she lacked a guidebook when it came to intimacy, relationships, and other things. She inhaled deeply as she got closer to where Mina and Kyoka were training. This was her answer. Since they were girls and his classmates, they undoubtedly knew everything she needed to know. She simply needed to inquire. She approached them with assurance, displaying her typical no-nonsense demeanor. When Mina saw her first, she waved excitedly. "Hey, Mei, what's up?" With her earphones pulling back from the dummy she had been aiming for, Kyoka looked up from her exercise. "Oh, hey, need something?" Mei didn't waste any time. "I need you two to teach me everything about 6. She spoke as nonchalantly as though she had been inquiring about the specifications of a new device. Kyoka's eyes widened and her face turned crimson red as Mina's jaw fell in an exaggerated scream. Kyoka stumbled, her earphone jacks twitching in surprise. What?" she said. "Teach you what?" Mina blinked once, then twice, and then smiled broadly. "Whoa, hold on, everything." Missing the social discomfort of her request, Mei nodded gravely. Her eyes glowed with the same passion she normally saved for explaining her babies. "Yeah, everything. I've been thinking about it a lot since yesterday. I want to know how it works, all the technical details, and what I should do to make it, effective." Kyoka and Mina looked at each other, obviously curious but still in disbelief. Mina bounced enthusiastically on her feet, the first to recover. "Oh my god, this is awesome. You wanna learn about that? You're coming to the right people." Kyoka rubbed her cheeks and moaned. "Mina, no, this is so awkward. We can't just talk about." Momo, who had just concluded her own training session, showed up before Kyoka could finish. Observing the strange looks on their faces, she approached the group with her customary poise. "Good afternoon, everyone. What's going on?" Mina hurried over to Momo right once, snatching her by the shoulders and shaking her enthusiastically. "Momo, you won't believe this. Mei just asked us to teach her everything about 6. Momo was thrown back and forth, her eyes widening as her cheeks flushed. Wait, what? Mei wants, what?" Mei gave Momo a really enthusiastic look. "I figured you guys would know what to do. I need practical information, and I don't want to go into this without being prepared. Izuku's counting on me." Mina clapped her palms together and released Momo. "This is amazing. Mei, you're so bold, I love it." Kyoka buried her face in her hands and moaned once more. "This is way too much for a normal afternoon." Still agitated, Momo gazed at Mei and attempted to gather herself. Mei, I think we can have a conversation about this, but maybe in a more private setting." Mina smiled and leaned in. "Oh no, Momo, I think she wants the full breakdown right here, right now. We gotta teach her everything." Mei nodded while maintaining a grave expression. "Exactly. I need to be prepared for anything, so give me the data. What do I need to know? Techniques, timing, proper execution." Mina bounced on her toes, almost squealing. "Okay, first of all, let's talk about foreplay. It's super important, trust me. You can't just jump into it, you gotta warm things up. Like testing out a prototype before running a full experiment." Still feeling ashamed, Kyoka appeared to want to sink into the earth. "Oh my god." Momo cleared her throat, clearly anxious now but doing her best to remain calm. Mei, maybe we should take a more, theoretical approach first. Understand the basics before diving into all the specifics." Mei gave her chin a contemplative tap. "Theoretical approach, sure, I'm good with that. But after, I'll need practical advice too. No sense in half-assing this, right?" Mina smiled slyly. "Oh, we're gonna give you all the advice, don't worry." Momo exhaled, smiling slightly but still flushed. "I suppose it's important to be well informed. We can talk about it more tonight if you truly are interested." The young inventor gave them the thumbs up and smiled. "Cool, I'll be sure to take extensive notes." There were more people than usual in Mei's lab turned home that evening. Mei's teachers, for the evening, were seated in the middle of the room. Momo sat on one side, appearing composed and ready to tackle the matter with an educational, well-rounded perspective. In contrast, Mina was virtually jumping in her chair, eager to share her own, more vivid account of what had happened. Despite her reluctance, Kyoka had consented to come for moral support, even though she was still flushing violently whenever the topic was brought up. Momo took a long breath before beginning her extremely calm and scholarly explanation. "All right, Mei, so let's begin with some basic. A knock on the door interrupted her before she could say anything further. Everyone froze, their eyes wide as they stared at one another. Mei's head cocked. I'm not expecting anyone. Mina leaned nearer the door and smiled mischievously. Well, let's see who it is. As the door opened, Setsuna Tokage from Class 1B was standing there with a big soda bottle in one hand and bags of chips in the other. She grinned broadly. Hey, guys, I'm ready for the sleepover. Everyone was staring at her in bewilderment as the room fell silent. But then Mina began to chuckle to herself. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention. Momo tilted her head and blinked. Sleepover. Kyoka's eyebrow went up. Mina, what did you tell her? Unaware of the unpleasant situation, Setsuna entered the room with assurance and tossed her bag of chips onto the closest table. She looked about at everyone, observing the slightly uncomfortable atmosphere, and said, yeah, Mina told me about an all-girls night happening here. I figured, why not join in the fun? What, did I miss something? Mina slapped her hand on her knee and started laughing. I may have suggested it was gonna be an all-girls night, but I didn't exactly mention what kind of night. Seeing the slightly odd energy in the room, Setsuna arched an eyebrow. Wait, what kind of night is this? Mina smiled. Well, it's kind of an educational one. She gave Mei a teasing look as she sat there, utterly unperturbed by the unexpected appearance of a new visitor. We're teaching Mei about, you know, that. Setsuna took a moment to consider what Mina was implying. When it clicked, her eyes grew wide. Unfazed, she smiled and said, oh, that kind of education. Well, count me in. If Mei's learning, I might as well pick up a few pointers too. Momo changed her posture as she blushed a little. I don't think this is quite what we had in mind for tonight. However, Setsuna dismissed Momo's worry with a simple laugh. Relax, Yaoyorozu. This is perfect. Let's make it a proper girls' night. Mina gave Momo a wink, obviously amused by the mayhem she had just caused. Looks like the group's growing, Momo. Kyoka buried her face in her hands and moaned. This was not how I thought tonight was gonna go. Mei shrugged, utterly indifferent to the change in plans. She turned to Setsuna and said, well, if more people mean more data, then I'm all for it. You got any expertise to share? With a giggle, Setsuna reached for a chip and put it in her lips. The whole situation became even more hilarious when she smiled and sat down, eager to contribute to the conversation. I mean, I'm not a total expert, but I know a thing or two. Mina was obviously enjoying every moment of the chaos as she reclined back with her arms folded behind her head. Alright, looks like we've got a full house now. Let's get this sleepover started. Momo cleared her throat, trying to remain professional in spite of the strange atmosphere in the room. Mei was sitting right in front of her, holding a notepad, and she had a serious look on her face as if she were going to take notes on a mechanical plan. While Kyoka sat next to Mina, grumbling to herself how awkward this was, Mina smiled as if she were getting ready for some mischief. With a mixture of interest and laughter, Setsuna watched the situation unfold while idly munching on her chips. Momo inhaled deeply and turned to face Mei. Alright, Mei, before we start, I need to ask, do you have any idea how, 6 works? Mei tapped her pen on the paper and nodded firmly. Obviously, the scientific part. Human biology, reproduction, how fertilization works, yada yada. Sperm meets egg, fertilization happens, boom, baby. The excessively complex response made Mina giggle, and Setsuna almost choked on her chips in an attempt to contain her laughter. Momo, still attempting to maintain her composure, nodded in agreement, but she couldn't help but feel a little ashamed of Mei's clinical tone. I see, Momo replied, straining to keep her normally composed expression. But have you ever seen any videos or imagery of a more, intimate or sexual nature? Mina and Setsuna both raised their hands in the air and waved them as if they were responding to a class question before Mei could reply. They all exclaimed, I have, without hesitation. Their desire caused Momo's face to flush. That's not what I meant. Mei glanced from one female to the next, blinking and furrowing her brow in perplexity. Videos, imagery, like research documentaries. Mina leaned forward and cackled. No, not like that, Mei. She means, you know, the really good stuff. Like those videos where people are. Kyoka's cheeks flushed even more, and she covered Mina's mouth with her hand. Mina, we don't need the graphic explanation. Mei tilted her head, still processing. So, there's more to it than just biology. In an attempt to return the conversation to a more realistic explanation, Momo nodded while he sighed. Yes, Mei, there's a lot more. Physical intimacy between partners involves, well, emotions, sensations, trust, and Setsuna added, smiling, and a lot of fun positions, while she kept eating her food. Setsuna simply shrugged, as though she were stating the obvious, but Momo gave her a glance. At last, Mina smiled and pulled Kyoka's fingers away from her mouth. Yeah, it's not just about science. There's a whole art to it. You gotta think of it like creating something amazing with your partner, just like when you work on your babies. Suddenly, Mei's eyes glowed with comprehension. Oh, so it's like crafting the perfect invention. It requires precision, testing, and mutual effort. I can work with that. Kyoka grimaced. Leave it to Mei to turn 6 into an engineering project. Momo chose to continue, her cheeks still heated. Well, sort of, but it's also about comfort and communication. Knowing what you and your partner like and making sure you're both on the same page. Mei drew frantically in her notebook. Comfort, communication, got it. Anything else? Mina leaned closer once more. Oh, so much more. I'll show you some moves later. Momo interrupted her abruptly and held up a hand. She gave Mei a slight smile and said, we'll stick to the basics first. The most important thing is trust. If you and Izuku are going to take that step, it has to be something you both feel comfortable with. It's not just about what happens physically, it's how you both feel during it. Mei stopped and thought about what Momo had said, her pen lingering over the paper. So, it's a partnership. Like co-developing a new invention. Mina gave a thumbs up and smiled. Exactly, but with way more fun. Kyoka mumbled something beneath her breath and moaned once more. I can't believe this is happening. Mei gazed up at Momo, now completely absorbed in the conversation. Okay, I think I get it now. So it's not just about the technical stuff. It's also about emotional connection, trust, and fun positions, apparently. Momo nodded despite her face turning hot once more. Yes, something like that. Mei jotted down more notes, satisfied. With a resolute smile, she glanced up at Momo, Mina, and Setsuna and said, okay. I'll organize it. Ensure everything is prepared for the monumental occasion. Thanks for the help. This'll be my greatest invention yet. Setsuna gave a wink. No problem, just make sure it's a safe invention. This is the weirdest study session I've ever been part of. Kyoka mumbled as Mina snorted. Mina moved forward with a mischievous grin on her face, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. Alright, Mei, I've gotta ask, have you ever masturbated? She asked. That other day, Mei's normally assured expression trembled for the first time. She looked aside quickly, obviously embarrassed, and her eyes widened as a frantic expression appeared on her face. What? Well, I mean. Mina's smile widened at the uncommon sight of Mei agitated. Hey, it's no big deal. I do it too, she said, dismissing Mei's uneasiness. Without hesitation, Setsuna added, tossing a chip into her lips. Yeah, same here, it's healthy, you know. After a moment of hesitation, Mei said, I guess I've done it a few times. Mina gave a supportive nod. See, totally normal. It's good to know your own body, Mei. How else are you gonna figure out what you like? Kyoka, seated in the room's corner, was nearly squishing into herself at the same time, her cheeks flushed scarlet. She burrowed, oh my god. I want to bury myself alive, and put her hands over her face. Momo, who had been struggling to maintain her composure during this increasingly embarrassing exchange, was suddenly the center of attention. She froze for a second, sensing that everyone was watching her. As they waited for her to weigh in, Mina and Setsuna raised their eyebrows in anticipation. Momo avoided making eye contact as her face became a deep shade of scarlet. She said, engaged in that sort of activity a couple of times, but her voice was barely audible. Kyoka moaned as if she were about to pass out from secondhand humiliation. Why are we talking about this? But Mina was enjoying the mayhem she'd brought about. You see, Momo is on board. Everyone does it, Mei. It's a way to discover who you are. Mei nodded thoughtfully, still blushing a little but obviously more relaxed after listening to everyone's confessions. All right, so, I suppose that's also a step in the process. Before the big event, the equipment should be tested, right? Quote. That's one way of putting it. Mina exclaimed with laughter. Quote. In a faux toast, Setsuna held up her soda bottle and smiled, saying, "Here's to self-discovery." Momo coughed gently, still flushed. Let's not dwell on that too much. It is crucial to comprehend not only your own body but also how it interacts with your partner's. Now that she was determined to approach this as if it were a significant engineering project, Mei scrawled down additional notes. Got it. Mutual comprehension, partner testing, and self-testing. It makes sense. I can't believe I'm part of this conversation, Kyoka said as she finally peered out from under her hands. Mina simply put an arm around Kyoka's shoulder and smiled. Welcome. Mei abruptly turned to Kyoka, her eyes wide with inquiry, her curiosity completely sparked by the casual confessions surrounding her. Hey, Jiro, do you touch yourself to Kaminari? Kyoka's jaw dropped, and her face instantly became crimson red. She jumped to her feet, screaming, what? As though she had been electrocuted. Mei, what the hell? Before Jiro could make her spectacular escape, Mina, who had been watching with delight, leapt up and started laughing. She laughed and pinned Jiro to the ground while she thrashed and thrashed beneath her hold. Oh no you don't, Jiro. You're not getting out of this one that easily, she exclaimed. I knew it, Setsuna exclaimed, gesturing to Jiro, laughing triumphantly. I totally called it. I always knew you had a thing for him. Jiro twisted in Mina's grasp, trying to shield her face, but her face was still scorching crimson. Shut up, it's not like that, she screamed. This is so embarrassing. Let me go. Mina tightened her hold while continuing to smile maniacally. Admit it, Jiro, you think about Denki in that way, don't you? Jiro buried her face in her hands and let out a loud groan. I'm going to die. This is it. This is how I die. Momo rubbed her temples in anger as she watched the entire event play out with a mixture of secondhand shame and frustration. This is getting out of hand. Unaware of Jiro's embarrassment, Mei leaned in closer, her eyes glimmering with scientific interest. On her notepad, she began writing again. So it is Denki, huh? That's interesting. I should make a note of that, she said. Jiro groaned with defeat. Oh my god, stop. This conversation is cursed. With a smug expression on her face, Setsuna laughed and leaned back. Can't deny it now, Jiro. Everyone here knows you've got it bad for him. Still held beneath Mina, Jiro said, I'm never hanging out with you guys again, through her hands. Jiro was still giggling, but Mina, who never lets her go easily, finally gave in and allowed her to sit up. Ah, come on, Jiro. We're all friends here, no need to be shy. Kyoka gave her a death gaze but remained silent, obviously too ashamed to continue arguing. Trying to preserve what little dignity she still had, she turned aside and folded her arms across her chest. Momo let out a long sigh and muttered something to herself. How did we even get to this point? Mei sat cross-legged in her room the following day, writing down notes on her notepad that was open in front of her. The air was filled with the familiar smell of machinery and oil, which was a slight solace in the absence of her favorite lab, from which she was still prohibited. Being away from her workspace was nearly intolerable, so the constraint bothered her, but she had managed to adjust as she always did. She wasn't solely focused on her creations today, though. A persistent afterimage of the previous night's sleepover was haunting her thoughts. In spite of the confusion, the taunting, and the awkward situations, all of the knowledge she had gained was enlightening and filled in gaps in her conception of closeness that she was unaware existed. With occasional pauses to gnaw her lip in contemplation, she swirled her pen between her fingers. Her perspective on sexual connections had changed as a result of what the girls had discussed, including the emotional bond, the physical reactions, and the deeper levels of trust involved. In her view, it had all been a clinical, somewhat mechanical comprehension until yesterday night. Just another system to comprehend, another aspect of human biology to analyze, was the act itself. However, everything felt so much more complicated now. She hadn't taken into consideration the depth of her emotions. Recalling some of Mina and Setsuna's more straightforward and detailed comments, particularly those pertaining to personal situations, caused Mei's cheeks to blush. She had been intrigued and surprised by the openness of their talk. It was more than just sensual enjoyment, it was about connection and a deeper understanding of another person than could be expressed in words. Her thoughts drifted back to Izuku as she tapped her pen across the page. Her connection with him had always been a mix of strange fondness for his awkward but resolute demeanor and awe for his power. But now that she knew this, she saw that there were options she hadn't thought of before, ways to strengthen that bond, if they both desired it. It wasn't that easy, of course. Even though Izuku loved her, Mei realized that going further would take time and a lot of conversation because she had witnessed how easily he became agitated. She kept thinking about the counsel from last night: trust, understanding, and preparation. Remembering how seriously she'd taken that idea, Mei grinned to herself at the last line. In her notepad, she made a few more notes. 1. Recognizing one's own boundaries. 2. The key is communication. 3. Mutual exploration should not be hurried. She added another point. 4. And her cheeks warmed up. Intimacy test steps need to be carefully planned. With a feeling of excitement growing in her chest, Mei reclined on her bed and gazed up at the ceiling. The unknown did not frighten her. On the contrary, it thrilled her. Mei Hatsume was always up for trying something new, and this new side of her relationship with Izuku was like undiscovered ground. Mei's phone rang next to her as she lay on her bed, her mind still racing with curiosity and excitement. After a few blinks, she snapped out of her reverie and reached for it. When she saw Ochako's name on the screen, a smile appeared on her face. She responded without hesitation. "Hey, Ochako, what's up?" "Hey, Mei," Ochako's infectious voice rang forth. "I was wondering if you wanted to come to the mall with me. It's been a while since we hung out, and I thought we could, do some shopping or grab something to eat." Mei immediately wanted to inquire about Izuku. "Is Izuku going too?" "Oh, no," laughed the person on the other end, Ochako. "He's busy training with All Might today. It's an intense session, so he's going to be tied up for a while." Mei scowled a little as disappointment struck her. She hoped to see him so they could discuss all she had been thinking about since last night. However, she swiftly brushed the thought aside because she knew he was preoccupied with his hero training. She wasn't always able to take up all of his time. Furthermore, she had been overworking herself lately, so it didn't seem horrible to take a break with Ochako at the mall. "All right, I'll be there," Mei responded with her customary zeal. "I could use some new tools anyway, and I'll probably find some interesting gadgets while I'm there." Ochako chuckled. "Of course you'd be thinking about gadgets. I'll meet you in 30 minutes. Feeling slightly better, Mei said, "Yep. See you there," and hung up. Perhaps going to the mall would help her decompress and divert her attention from the whirlwind of Izuku and everything she had discovered about intimacy. She leapt from the bed, gathered her belongings, and prepared to leave. It would be nice to spend some time with a buddy, even though her thoughts were still focused on her connection with Izuku. Mei hurriedly collected her tools, arranged them in their proper locations, and left the room. A warm smile came across her lips as she strolled down the street toward the mall, her thoughts inexorably returning to Izuku. Now that she knew so much more about intimacy, she considered how far they could go and the progress they had made in their relationship. The thought of becoming nearer to him in ways she hadn't given any thought to previously had her heart skip a beat. She was excited with anticipation at the prospect of feeling that more profound, personal love. She had a mental image of them holding hands and having those intimate, heartfelt moments that went beyond embraces and kisses. She desired to experience that bond, to partake in something unique and exclusively theirs. Her body responded almost immediately to the vividness of her thoughts, her heartbeat speeding and her cheeks flushing. "Okay, calm down, Hatsume," she shook her head and spoke to herself. "No need to overheat your engine just yet." She inhaled deeply and concentrated on controlling her thoughts. She told herself to exercise patience, even though she was excited to investigate this new aspect of her connection with Izuku. She didn't want to rush things before they were both ready, and they had time. She was aware that Izuku would likely prefer to go slowly as well, given his reserved and contemplative personality. Step by step, she muttered as a smile returned to her face. "But I'm definitely looking forward to it." Mei accelerated her speed, eager to meet Ochako and enjoy the day, her excitement mostly under control. She might benefit from some amusement and diversion, and conversing with her friend might help her manage her feelings. The thrill would have to wait for now. Mei and Ochako strolled through the crowded mall stores, laughing and chatting while perusing the clothing and electronics. Their relationship, which had previously been more harsh and aloof, had developed into one of true camaraderie. Mei found that she enjoyed Ochako's company more than she had anticipated when they initially met. Having true friends again, people who embraced her for her eccentricities, her inventions, and all that made her Mei was a welcome change. Mei found herself grinning as they passed storefronts, not only at Ochako's contagious chuckle but also at the unexpected turn her life had taken. She had people who cared about her, and perhaps most significantly, she had Izuku, so she was no longer just the strange girl lost in her work. Her smile widened even further as her thoughts returned to him. Her partner, Izuku, is considerate, caring, kind, and, well, really attractive. Her life had been so much more fascinating and rewarding because of him. He was more than simply her love companion. He understood her passions, supported her goals, and gave her encouragement that no one else had ever given her. Having someone like him by her side felt amazing, and she was excited to see what else their relationship could develop into. When Ochako said, "Hey, Mei, you okay?" she snapped out of her reverie. As she continued to smile, Mei answered, "Huh. Oh, yeah, I'm good, just thinking." Ochako teased, "About gadgets, or something else?" Mei rubbed the back of her neck and laughed. "A little bit of both," she said. "But mostly someone else." Ochako laughed with knowledge. "Deku, huh?" Mei's cheeks began to flush a little as she nodded. I dunno, he's made everything in my life so much more awesome. I never thought I'd have someone like him, you know. And now, I just want to keep making him proud, keep pushing things forward." Ochako gave a kind smile. "He's really lucky to have you too, Mei. You two make a great couple." Mei responded, "Thanks," with a surge of pride in her heart. She valued Ochako's sincere encouragement. It meant a lot to her from someone she now regarded as a true friend. Mei was overcome with appreciation for the people in her life as they carried on shopping and enjoying the day. She had Izuku, she had true friends, and most of all, she had a more promising and exciting future than she could have ever dreamed. Ochako gave Mei a kind grin. "When you open up your first shop, I'll gladly be one of your top clients. You've got some of the best support tech I've ever seen." The thought caused Mei's eyes to light up, and she instantly started coming up with ideas for her future support tech company. "Oh, you have no idea how many prototypes I have in mind. We could have specialized gadgets for pro heroes, sidekicks, and even civilians who need safety tools. I could integrate quirk-specific functions, emergency shields, or even..." A tremendous crash reverberated around the mall before she could finish her eager digression. They both jerked their heads in the direction of the sound, which was the sound of two robbers who had just exploded from a jewelry store with bags full of stolen merchandise. As the two crooks ran along the mall corridor, straight toward Ochako and Mei, the crowd dispersed in fear. Ochako said, "Stay back, Mei." As her expression darkened, she moved ahead of Mei and swiftly used her quirk, ready to stop the robbers with a glowing hand. Despite her worries, Mei remained in her spot, closely observing Ochako. She had no devices with her, no inventions to help with the problem, but her mind was racing with ideas of how she could help. She trusted Ochako's skills, but it was frustrating to watch helplessly. The bandits approached, utterly oblivious to the threat they were confronting. Ochako waited patiently for them to approach, her gaze fixed on their motions. She touched one of the criminals with her fingertips, and her quirk was activated, sending him floating helplessly into the air. "What the?" the robber cried, thrashing above the floor. Ochako ran forward, utilizing the force to sweep his legs out from under him before the second thief could react. She swiftly touched his body as he landed with a heavy thud, sending him floating up beside his buddy. "Gotcha," Ochako exclaimed with assurance, holding the two robbers in midair while they fought to escape. Despite her admiration, Mei was a little concerned. As she saw Ochako manage the situation with accuracy, her heart raced, yet she couldn't help but wonder what would have occurred if things hadn't gone as planned. She wasn't used to being in the field, but it made her realize how crucial her support tech could be to heroes like Ochako. "I wish I had one of my prototypes with me," Mei mumbled under her breath, her fingers aching to fiddle with something, as she watched things unfold. It served as a reminder to her that she needed to keep refining and developing her ideas to help heroes better protect themselves and others. Ochako waved to Mei after swiftly bringing the bandits under control and preventing their escape. "All clear, I'll just wait for security to come by." Mei hurried over, her eyes bright with worry and excitement. "You handled that like a pro, Ochako. But what if they had been more dangerous? I should have had something with me to help. I need to work faster on portable tech." Ochako's cheeks was still a little red from the adrenaline, but she chuckled softly. "Thanks, Mei, but honestly, I think you're doing just fine. You'll be helping out more heroes in no time with your inventions." Mei couldn't get rid of the thought that she should be even more ready the next time, even as mall security showed up to apprehend the robbers. Observing Ochako in action only strengthened her resolve to develop even more advanced support technology. She would do everything it took to ensure the safety of Izuku, Ochako, and her other pals. A powerful force jerked Mei backward as she and Ochako stood in the middle of the mall's bustle. With a knife thrust perilously near her cheek, a third man, unkempt and enraged, grabbed her tightly. "Let them go, or I'll cut her face open," he said, his breath hot against her ear. Ochako halted, her eyes wide with disbelief, her heart pounding. With her fists clutched at her sides, she yelled, "Let her go." In a tremulous but determined voice, she tried to think of a way to stop him without endangering Mei further. Mei's gaze was fixed on the knife, which was glinting icily only a few inches away from her skin. She felt as though her heart could burst from the intense pounding in her chest. Her breath became shallow and her forehead was plastered with sweat. Fear gripped her tighter as her body began to shake violently. The cold steel against her cheek and the man's threats evoked a barrage of gloomy memories. She was reminded of the fear she had that day and the image of Toga's knife cutting into her skin. Her breathing became rough and irregular as her chest tightened. Mei's instincts, however, begged her to take action despite the fog of panic. Her only hope was the tiny Swiss Army knife she felt in her pocket. She reached for it with trembling hands, flicking it open with fumbling fingers. She stabbed the man in the leg in a quick, desperate outburst. His hold briefly relaxed as he let out a cry of agony. "Mei!" exclaimed Ochako. She ran ahead and gave the man's side a quick, forceful knee strike. The blow was so strong that he collapsed on the ground, unconscious. However, the triumph was fleeting. As Mei's mind whirled, the anguish of Toga's attack mingling with the new terror, her body started to shake violently. Her hand gripped her chest as if it might prevent her heart from exploding as she fell to her knees, panting for oxygen. Panic gripped every fiber of her being as the world around her narrowed and became blurry. Ochako knelt next to her, her face displaying fear and panic. "Mei, it's okay, you're safe now," she uttered in a desperate attempt to communicate with her. Mei, however, was unable to hear her. Fear and unpleasant memories of that attack, Toga's icy smile, and the knife penetrating her flesh, took over her thoughts. Panic took hold of her and wouldn't let go. Ochako shook Mei's shoulders tenderly, almost crying. "Please, Mei, just breathe, I'm here." As she fought to escape the panic, Mei's vision darkened and her breath came in short gasps. Then everything turned dark.
I will continue the story in next part. Till then, bye bye.